Tyranny of Steel. Chapters 231 to 248. Chapter 231 Honoria's Journey Part 3. It had been close to a week since Honoria and the galley she was on first departed from Constantinople. They quickly passed through the Bosphorus and into the Black Sea. During this time, she stayed entirely in the captain's quarters, where she was allotted as her personal space by Agnellus. The man commonly brought her and her pet eagle, Heraclius, food and water to sustain themselves. Honoria did not have much to do during this time, so she merely entertained herself by daydreaming about what it would be like when she finally arrived in Kufstein and met with Berengar face to face. She was like a young girl who had her first crush. Though she never met the man, she could already envision what he looked like. She imagined Berengar to have blonde hair and blue eyes, as she mistakenly believed that all Germans had. However, the image in her head was slightly different from the real Berengar. Her imagination of Berengar was not scarred from battle and lacked the eye patch. He also had shoulder-length hair that was center-parted and was not quite as handsome as the actual man. She would be greatly surprised when she finally met the real Berengar and realized he was even better looking than she thought he would be. Nevertheless, in her mind, she imagined all kinds of scenarios. Maybe he would leave his two women and marry her instead, or perhaps he would do something scandalous like add her to his harem. She began to blush as she imagined the thought of a lowly count keeping an imperial princess like her in his harem. It was simply too outrageous for her inexperienced mind to handle. As such, she quickly shook her head and stuffed it face first into her pillow. Heraclius merely gazed at the girl like she were an idiot and screeched in response. Hearing his voice made Honoria look out from above her pillow and glared at the bird. It was clear that she had taken offense to whatever the bird had said. Whether Honoria understood the eagle's words or simply was so well accustomed with the bird that she knew his general intent by the pitch of his screech, the fact remained that she was not pleased with what Heraclius had said, and as such, she chastised him. "I am not. You should mind your words, Heraclius." However, her fun was quickly interrupted by a knock on the door and the voice of Agnellus behind it. "Can I come in?" Honoria rushed over to the door and slightly cracked it open while peering outside. Seeing the friendly gaze of Agnellus, she let out a sigh of relief before asking the question on her mind. "What is it?" Agnellus instantly began to scratch his chin as he informed the princess of the journey's current progress. "We are about to pass through the Empire's borders at the Black Sea and enter the Danube. When we reach the first major town in Wallachia, we will be stopping for supplies and trade. If you wish, you can stretch your legs then and get some fresh air. If you do want to wander into the town, I suggest you stay close by my side. You never know who is out to harm you." Agnellus's sister had reminded him to watch out for Honoria, and as such, he did not intend to let any harm befall the naive and innocent young girl. If something happened to her on his watch, the Byzantine imperial family would massacre his entire family in the act of vengeance if they were ever to find out. After hearing this, a pretty smile formed itself on Honoria's pink lips. She was excited to get out of this cabin and see the world. As such, she quickly nodded her head and expressed her desire to get off the ship when they arrived. "I look forward to it. I promise I won't cause any trouble." Having heard this, Agnellus sighed before muttering beneath his breath, "Don't make promises you can't keep." Of course, Honoria did not hear what he said, and as such, Agnellus departed without incident. Agnellus was a practical man, and having Honoria on the ship was already an enormous risk, but bringing her into a town in Wallachia, she was bound to cause trouble. Nevertheless, he couldn't just keep her locked up for the entire journey. That would be inhumane. Honoria quickly closed the door after Agnellus left and had a broad smile on her face. She could finally see what the world looked like. She could hardly contain her excitement and instantly began to tell Heraclius of the good news. Of course, as an eagle, he had excellent hearing and had already figured out the details from the conversation at the doorway. That did not prevent Honoria from repeating it, though. "Heraclius, we are finally going to get to some solid ground. I can't wait to mingle with the local Wallachians. I wonder what they're like." Heraclius merely rolled his eyes at the naive girl. He could already feel a headache taking over. He would be forced to protect her from wicked men once more, or so the proud eagle thought within its mind. An hour later, the ship docked in a medium-sized river town along the Danube in Wallachia. This town was called Brăila and was the main harbor of Wallachia. After docking on the ship, Agnellus knocked on the cabin's door, where Honoria quickly opened it with a wide grin on her face. Seeing the young princess was so pretty and naive, Agnellus threw a set of less luxurious clothing in her direction that featured a shawl. After doing so, he said in a severe tone, "Wear this, and keep your face covered at all times. I don't want any trouble to occur because of your appearance." Hearing this, Honoria was perplexed. After all, she was completely unaware of the degree of beauty she naturally possessed. If she were to walk around uncovered, it would surely attract attention. Despite the question in her heart, she was obedient and shut the door, where she quickly changed out of her lavish attire and into something much more modest. She quickly covered her head and face with the shawl before revealing herself outside the cabin's entrance. The shawl resembled that of a Catholic headscarf, and when combined with a face veil, perfectly covered up the girl's natural beauty, aside from her glimmering mint-green eyes. Seeing she was covered correctly, Agnellus began to escort her off the ship. In doing so, the rest of the crew gazed upon Honoria with curious expressions. They knew there was a VIP staying within the captain's cabin, but they had no idea it was a woman. Some of them had more wicked thoughts in their heads, and others were merely curious, but the way Agnellus glared at his crew immediately halted any inappropriate ideas that the men might be scheming. As they entered the town, Heraclius took off into the air, watching Honoria from above like a guardian angel. He felt cramped within the cabin since they left Constantinople and needed to spread his wings for a bit. However, he never let Honoria out of his vigilant gaze. As for Agnellus, he made sure the young girl stayed close by so that she didn't get herself into any trouble. While his crew was out purchasing the necessary supplies for the journey, and others were paying a visit to the local brothels, Agnellus was stuck babysitting the young princess. Eventually, the young princess spotted a store that caught her interest. It was a local tailor. She had a great interest in seeing the local designs that Wallachian women wore. She was so excited she ran ahead from Agnellus. Upon seeing this, the man almost called out to her before realizing that he did not know what to call her. He very well couldn't call her by her first name, but if he used her honorific, it would immediately alert people to her position. Thus all he could do was chase after Honoria as she rushed towards the tailor's. However, before Honoria could enter the building, she ran into a well-dressed man and fell onto her butt. As she looked up, she saw a young man with shoulder-length jet-black hair and amber eyes glare at her with a sense of fury in his eyes. However, when he noticed Honoria's flawless mint-green eyes beneath her headdress, his furious gaze disappeared. And a wicked smile appeared on his face. This young man was a mighty boyar of Wallachia, a high-ranking nobleman, and he was quite the handsome individual. Because of this, he was particularly lecherous, and he had enough experience to instantly realize the excellent shape of Honoria's body hidden beneath her clothing. Seeing how she was dressed as a peasant woman, the boyar began to take advantage of the situation and scolded the girl in front of him. "Do you have any idea who I am? How dare you ruin my expensive coat? I demand payment." It was only then that Honoria realized that the mud from the streets had splashed onto the man's coat, and seeing as how she had no money, she did not know how to react to this. As such, she lowered her head and apologized. "I am sorry, but I don't have any money to repay you for the damage I have caused." Hearing this, the boyar was even more confident that the girl was an impoverished peasant, and thus he began to lick his lips as he imagined what form of beauty this girl was hiding behind her veil. The boyar instantly wrapped his arm around the woman's neck and dragged her close while squeezing her chest before whispering in her ear, "I know a way you can repay me." Feeling the man grab at her chest, Honoria immediately flinched and slapped the man in the face before making some distance between herself and the mighty boyar. The moment she did so, she cursed at him. "How dare you touch me?" After being slapped by the woman he believed to be a peasant, the man felt his inner fury rising, and thus he pulled out his sword on his belt and began screaming at Honoria. "You filthy peasant whore, you dare to lay a hand on my flawless face, I will have your head." The moment he charged at Honoria, Hercules swept down from the sky above with a screech of fury. He had looked away for no more than a minute to catch a nearby rabbit, and yet Honoria had already gotten herself into trouble. The eagle bravely rushed towards the defense of the princess, where his talons dug into the young man's sword hand, tearing through flesh and bone alike, forcing the man to drop the blade. Coincidentally, this also happened to be the hand the man had used to assault Honoria. The young man screamed in agony as he tried to shake Heraclius away, but the more he did, the more damage was dealt with his hand. In this day and age, The damage done to the muscles in hand was enough to make sure that the boyar never again wielded a sword. As such, the blood quickly flowed onto the ground before Heraclius released the man's hand, where he flew back onto Honoria's shoulder and screeched fearsomely at the wounded boyar. The fury in Heraclius's gaze was enough to intimidate the fool who began to soil his pants. If Heraclius wanted to, he could have claimed the young man's life. The crowd that had gathered stood in shock as they witnessed a member of the local nobility get so thoroughly defeated by the eagle. Even Agnellus was amazed at the lengths the bird would go to protect the girl. Though he immediately snapped out of his shock, he quickly arrived before dragging Honoria and the bird away. After such an incident with a member of the local nobility, it was best to get out of Dodge as quickly as possible. Thus, Honoria was led back to the ship while Agnellus scolded her along the way. "Goddammit, I fucking told you to stay nearby. This was exactly the kind of shit I was trying to prevent." On the other hand, Honoria was pouting. She was shocked and dismayed over the sexual assault that the local nobleman had done to her out of nowhere and instantly became bitter about it. If she were still within the borders of the Byzantine Empire, she would have revealed her identity to have the man executed for such a heinous act. She made a mental note of this and vowed never to suffer such humiliation again in the future. After returning to the ship, Honoria lay down upon her bed with a depressed expression on her face. She thought a great deal as to what had happened and immediately asked a question to Heraclius. "Count Berengar won't be such a scandalous individual, will he?" The proud eagle merely gazed at Honoria with a frustrated expression. This girl could not help but get into trouble, and once more, he had risked his life to help her out. As such, he merely squawked at Honoria before shifting his head away as if he were ignoring her, causing the young girl to sink further into depression. As for Agnellus, he made sure nobody had seen them enter the ship and tried to round up his men as quickly as possible. Because of this incident, they would have to finish their resupply at the next town. Thus, before the boyar could retaliate, the galley had departed and traveled further down the Danube. Hopefully, they would not have to deal with the consequences of the scene that had just transpired. Chapter 232 Blessed with an exceptional child. While Berniger's agricultural reforms were slowly but surely being implemented across the realm, the man was presented with a great sense of difficulty. Soon it would be Adela's 14th birthday, and he had no idea what to get the girl. Though the betrothed couple did not live together, that did not mean that Berengar did not shower his little fiancée with presents. He would send her dresses, shoes, jewelry, and fashionable accessories that were fit for an empress every chance he got. Of course, Adela's birthday was not the only one Berengar had to prepare for. Linda's birthday was shortly after hers, and just like Adela, he showered her with lavish gifts whenever he got the chance. He truly spoiled his two women to a degree that a normal duke was incapable of. Adela's birthday was on September 9th, while Linda's was on October 15th. They were a little over a month apart. As for Berengar, his birthday was December 21st. However, he frankly did not care about his birthday. It just became another day of the year after a certain point. Until he could get his hands on the precious substance known as chocolate, Berengar was quite disappointed with his birthday as he could not continue his yearly tradition of eating triple-layer German chocolate cake, which to him was a disaster. However, that was not important at the moment. What was important was getting Adela a proper gift for her birthday. He could easily shop for Lind. He would simply have his tailor make her a luxurious, and more importantly, sexy lingerie set. However, for someone like Adela, that was not exactly something he could do without feeling like a creep. As such, he was in a serious debate with his mind while sitting in his chair drinking from his skull chalice that was filled with beer. He was pretty troubled over the issue. He could not just give her some more meaningless jewelry or clothing. It had to be something exceptional, something the girl did not usually receive from him. It was at this moment he thought of something interesting, something he had not considered before. What if he bought her a new horse? Something exotic that cost a fortune to import. What if he bought her a white Arabian? To him, this idea was perfect. He never bought either of his women horses, and he knew that Adela was fond of the creatures. Lind loved cats, but Adela loved horses. Upon thinking about such a brilliant, he immediately got to task writing a letter to his old friend Arethusa from the Byzantine Empire. If there were anyone Berengar knew that could get him a white Arabian in time for Adela's birthday, it would be the strategos of Ionia. After drafting the letter, he quickly had it sent out with a proper messenger party. It was times like this that Berengar seriously missed the modern world and its advanced communication methods. After sending out his request, Berengar returned to his office where he let out a heavy sigh before breaking out the distilled spirits. When it came to hard liquor, Berengar had opted for making whiskey, and though this batch was not aged to any serious extent, it was enough to help calm his nerves. Berengar began to reflect upon the past year and a half of his life. So much had happened in this time that he rarely had a moment like this to relax. He was fortunate to be alive, let alone making it as far as he had. He still had no idea how he had reincarnated into this world, but he began to consider that perhaps it was some form of deity's work, yet if that were so, what could be their motive in doing so? These were the ideas that Berengar stressed about within his spare time. He was so busy thinking all day long that he did not know how to shut it off, so to calm down, he thought about things that could not be proven and merely speculated about them as a mental exercise. At the very least, it kept his mind healthy. Berengar had spent so much time in his study lately that it had become second nature to come to this room and sit down, even if he had nothing to do. Lind had begun to joke around about how he spent more time with his study's leather-bound chair than he did with her. Speak of the devil, and he shall appear. The moment Berengar thought about his lover, he heard a knock on his door, where he quickly answered it. Come in. After doing so, Lind appeared dressed in another sky-blue dress. When she was not wearing the colors of his house, she tended to enjoy dressing in sky blue and white, as it brought out her beautiful eyes. Seeing his handsome lover standing in front of him with a happy smile on her face, Berengar was confused. Thus he asked about it. What has got you so happy? Lind approached Berengar and grabbed a hold of his hands, and began to drag him away without explanation. Curious as to what had gotten the woman so excited, he allowed her to do so before long. He was swiftly dragged to Hans' room by the woman he loved, where she opened the door to reveal the small child standing on his two legs and walking over to Henrietta, who was nearby and smiling. Berengar was not too surprised when he saw this. After all, it was about time for the child to walk. However, what came next greatly surprised him. The baby boy saw his father enter the room and ran over to him as fast as he could while saying, Dada. Mama. This stunned Berengar. The child still had some ways to go before they should naturally be able to form words. Yet, he clearly stated the terms that were usually a child's first words at around 12 months old. Seeing such a strange occurrence, Berengar could not contain his thoughts and let them slip from his tongue. Holy shit! Lind immediately glared at Berengar when he used profanity in front of their infant son, and he instantly shut his trap. Hans was close to 9 months old at this point. After all, he had been born at the very end of the last year, and it was not yet September. Despite this, he was walking quite effortlessly and already talking to some degree. Berengar could not help but believe the kid was some form of genius, and he quickly stared at Lind with confusion. The way he looked at Lind made her uncomfortable, and she awkwardly inquired about his gaze. What? Why are you staring at me like that? Berengar did not hide what he was thinking and quickly revealed his thoughts. What kind of super genes does your family have? Lind, of course, had no idea what genetics was and thus was deeply perplexed by Berengar's question. As such, she expressed her confusion. Genes? Berengar merely shook his head and dismissed the idea. Never mind, it is not important. He knew the kid did not get the intelligence from his family. While his family was above average in intelligence, with some just breaking the barrier to enter Mensa, there were no legitimate geniuses in his family, at least in the classical sense. Of course, the moment he thought about that, he realized this body did not have the same genetic composition as his original body. While pondering about such things, Berengar had to admit that he did not know much about the von Kufstein lineage aside from the fact that they were a house of warriors. The kid might have got his intellect from Berengar's genes. Truthfully, he did not know the answer, but if the child turned out to be as intelligent as Berengar thought he would be based upon the signs available to him at present, then it was a good indicator that Hans might be an exemplary candidate for succeeding himself in the future. The kid eventually ran over to Berengar, where the young duke picked the boy up and tousled his strawberry blonde hair. Berengar stared lovingly at his child before looking him into the eyes and saying something profound. My child, one day you will be a greater man than I. The way Hans looked at Berengar seemed like he understood what Berengar meant. However, Berengar merely hugged his son before giving him back to his mother. It would still be a long time before Hans was able to show off his true potential, but Berengar had great faith in the child. It was nice to know that if nurtured properly, the empire Berengar believed he would forge one day would be in good hands after his passing. Even if one of his other children turned out to be a better fit for the monarch's position, Hans could still play a pivotal role in the advancement and development of the empire. This was something Berniger sincerely believed, and he was glad that he had been blessed with such an exceptional child. Whether it was his genes or Linda's that produced such a child did not matter. After all, the two of them were bound to have several more children over the upcoming years. If it did turn out to be his own, then maybe his kids with Adela would inherit such traits as well. Only time would tell. Chapter 233. The Hussite representatives arrive. After a long journey from Bohemia to Kufstein, a group of men dressed in common clothing approached the city gates of Kufstein. From afar, these men gazed upon the mighty star-shaped walls of Kufstein with awe. Such fortifications proved that their leaders had made the right choice in contacting the man behind the German Reformation. Within the Kingdom of Bohemia, civil conflict was brewing, inspired by the great reformer Jan Hus. Both the nobility and common people within the region were up in arms against the Catholic Church for many of the same reasons that southern Germany was. With the unjust execution of Jan Hus in 1415, a group of his followers referred to by the term Hussites had begun to grow violent in the wake of his death. In Berengar's previous life, a war broke out in the Kingdom of Bohemia between the Hussites and the Catholic Church in the year 1420. However, Berengar's intervention in this timeline and the rise of his German Reformation had sparked more significant conflict from the Hussites. The latter had grown emboldened by Berengar's success in his battles against the Catholic forces. By now, Bohemia was on the verge of civil war. Thus these men, acting as representatives of the Hussite movement, had come to Kufstein, the center of the German Reformation, seeking aid from the mighty Duke Berengar. As such, these men waited in the long line that had gathered to enter the city of Kufstein. Berengar had implemented strict security measures to avoid infiltration by potentially hostile groups and individuals. Because of this, every man, woman, and child that sought to enter the city had to undergo an inspection. All arms were required to be deposited with the garrison and would only be returned once the visitors left the town. After waiting for some time, the men were hailed by the guards signaling that they may approach. The guard observed the men who were garbed in relatively common attire and immediately assumed they were refugees. If you wish to seek refuge within the city of Kufstein, you must fill out an application. I can give you a pass that will allow you to enter the city, where you will be led to the Department of Immigration. They will determine if you meet the criteria to migrate to Austria. However, the man in charge of the group of diplomats immediately shook his head upon hearing this and declared his actual intent for entering the city. We are not here to seek refuge. Instead, we seek an audience with the Duke. We come from the Kingdom of Bohemia and have important matters to discuss with the man known as Duke Berengar the Reformer. The city guard immediately sighed heavily before giving the standard response to everyone who sought to meet with the Duke. There is currently a 3-month wait for an audience with the Duke. Unless you represent a powerful foreign interest, the most I can do is allow you access to the city so that you may wait your turn patiently. Due to Berengar's position and popularity, many people from all walks of life wanted to meet with him. So much so that a waiting list had been established. At the moment, it was backlogged up to 3 months in total. Berengar was an incredibly busy man, and he could not afford to compromise his work to meet with every person who desired an audience with him. Unless it were some powerful foreign entity, then they would be forced to wait until Berengar's schedule was free. Upon hearing this, the Hussite diplomats frowned. They had not intended to reveal their identity until they met with Berengar. However, it would appear they were forced to do so early in order to meet with the young Duke in a timely manner. Thus the man who led these diplomats removed his hood and revealed his entire appearance before speaking his thoughts. I am Ludik Hlavacek. I represent the interests of the Hussite Reformation within the Kingdom of Bohemia. As a fellow reformist, I believe your Duke will want to hear what we have to say. I would greatly appreciate it if you could relay our message to the man. Hearing that the man was a representative of another Cressida reformist movement, the guard immediately asked for verification of their identities. Do you have anything that can prove your claims? If not, you will be forced to wait like the rest of the visitors. Ludik immediately pulled out a letter that contained the seal of a lord from Bohemia known as Alexei Kaspar as proof of his identity. Alexei Kaspar was a man known far and wide as a leader of the Hussite movement, or one of the many groups it comprised of. After observing this, the guard recognized its validity and parted ways for the diplomats to enter the city. Before doing so, he said his piece. "I will inform His Grace, Berengar von Kufstein, of your arrival. You can wait within the city until someone leads you towards the castle." The Hussite diplomats immediately bowed their heads respectfully and thanked the guard. "You have our thanks." With this, they were moved into the city, where they awaited their meeting with Berengar. Berengar was sitting on his ducal throne, openly playing with Lind in a rather inappropriate manner. He tended to grope the woman of his desires in public every so often to establish his dominance. It was quite honestly one of the more primitive instincts of his mind, but it played an important part in letting his subjects know not to covet what was his. By now, Lind was flushed with embarrassment, but this public display of affection while sitting on Berengar's lap had made her dreadfully excited. She was starting to exhibit traits of an exhibitionist due to Berengar's thorough training. Even though nobody was around to see her, the idea that someone could walk in on them during their intimate acts was enough to get her aroused. Of course, it was at this moment one of Berengar's guards walked in and saw that Berengar had reached through Linda's dress and was firmly grasping a hold of one of her bountiful breasts with his left hand. Seeing that someone had intruded upon his fun, Berengar sighed before expressing his annoyance. "What is it? Can't you see that I am busy?" Hearing this, Lind looked around and saw that the guard was trying his best not to stare at the lascivious act. She immediately began to blush heavily, but Berengar did not stop groping her, which caused a slight moan to escape her lips. This only caused her to be further embarrassed. The guard pretending like he had not seen anything. After all, Lind was still fully clothed. It was just that Berengar's left hand had reached through the upper portion of her dress. After looking away from the two lovers, the guard announced his reason for stopping by. "Your Grace, there are a group of people who have arrived that claim to represent the Hussite movement from Bohemia. They are requesting an audience with you. They say it is a matter of dire importance." Hearing this, Berengar's left hand immediately retracted Linda's bosom, where he licked the milk off of his fingers. One might call Berengar a pervert for his tastes, but since Lind began to develop breast milk, he had greatly enjoyed drinking the substance, typically directly from the source. After all, in his mind, there were few better sources of protein and calcium than his lover's breast milk. After doing such a lewd act, he responded with an authoritative tone as if he was completely unfazed by his own actions. "Bring them here. I very much desire to meet with these men." After giving his commands, the guard saluted before leaving the area to fetch the diplomats. Even though Berengar and Lind were alone again, he did not resume his lecherous acts and instead addressed his lover with a gentle tone. "Looks like we will have to wait a bit longer before we can finish what we started. You can take care of yourself in the meantime, right?" Lind immediately blushed upon hearing this and nodded while looking away in embarrassment as she departed from the great hall and returned to the bedroom, where she would play with herself for the time being. As for Berengar, he had guests to entertain, and as such, sat in a manner that hid his excitement. There was nothing worse in his mind than getting cock-blocked right when things were about to get interesting. Berengar waited for some time for the Hussite diplomats to arrive. He was rather intrigued by this. Though he figured sooner or later they would come to greet him, he assumed it would be after the war had already begun. Yet, they were already present in his court, which meant that clearly, he had an impact on this timeline. His intelligence that pertained to Bohemia was rather slim. Still, he would make sure to take advantage of the Hussite wars and annex the German-speaking regions into his territory. After all, the Sudetenland was in Berengar's mind rightful German clay, and if he were to unify the German Empire in the future, he would need these lands as his own. Thus he began to hatch a scheme on how best to take advantage of the war in Bohemia for his personal gains, without directly getting involved in the war itself. After all, now that he had an era of peace to establish his hegemony, he intended to take full advantage of it. Chapter 234 Negotiations with the Hussites. After some time, the Hussite representatives arrived in Berengar's great hall and kneeled before him with great respect. Not only was Berengar a mighty duke, but in the eyes of the Hussites, he was a man inspired by the teachings of Jan Hus, and as such, a brother in arms against the oppression of the Catholic Church. The man in charge of the diplomats quickly introduced himself as not to keep Berengar waiting. "I am Ludik Hlavacek, a humble servant of the Count Alexei Kaspar, leader of the Kasparian sect of the Hussite movement. Berengar had not heard of the Kasparian sect from his previous life. Then again, as far as he was aware, few important figures of the era from his past life existed in this timeline, so it was only natural for some things to be changed. Ludic was a relatively short man. Despite this, he was solidly built and had a set of long brown hair, with a matching beard. His eyes were the color of amber, and he had a scar across his left cheek, adding some notion that the man was battle-tested. The other two men who flanked Ludic wore their hoods and concealed their identities, though Berengar did not challenge them to reveal themselves. After all, they were a religious movement wanted by the church as heretics. He could sympathize with their desire to hide their faces. Berengar quickly addressed the men who had entered his great hall. "I am Duke Berengar von Kufstein. As one of the founders of the German Reformation, I welcome you as brothers in arms. Though I am curious as to why you have made the journey from Bohemia to my humble abode." Berengar had a rough idea of what they were here for, but if what they desired was what he thought it would be, he would, unfortunately, have to decline them. However, he made it appear as if he was genuinely confused, thus giving them the ability to explain themselves. Ludic did not shy from the topic at hand and quickly addressed his reason for being in Kufstein. Bohemia is on the brink of war. Just recently in Prague, 7 members of the city council were defenestrated. The King of Bohemia has sided with the Vatican and seeks to suppress our movement. We have come asking for assistance from the man who so thoroughly defeated the mighty Teutonic Order. Berengar was slightly surprised. It was only 1418, yet Prague's first defenestration was moved up by roughly a year. This meant that what the delegate had said was likely to be true. It would not be long before Bohemia plunged into civil war, and the Hussite wars had fully begun. However, Berengar began to rest his head on his right fist as he made his stance clear. "If you seek for me to invade Bohemia with my forces, I am afraid I am going to have to disappoint you." After saying this, Ludic's face turned grim, and he immediately asked about the concerns on his mind. "Why not? Did you not just say we are brothers in arms? Will you truly abandon us in our time of need?" Berengar knew this would be brought up, and as such, he immediately replied with his reasoning. "I have spent the last year at war with my enemies. The Bavarians have ravaged the lands that are now under my authority during their occupation. Now that I am Duke and have established a sense of peace and stability within Austria, I cannot afford to march off to war once more so quickly. During this era of peace, I need to take advantage of this time to stabilize my reign and rebuild what has been destroyed. I cannot spare the troops while there is an ongoing war just outside my borders that could invade my lands at any moment. You are like brothers to me, but my people are like my children, and thus I need to look after them first. I hope you can understand." Hearing this reasoning, Ludic bowed his head. What Berengar said made sense. The rest of Germany was embroiled in a bloody civil war, with only Austria maintaining a peaceful existence, and it had cost them dearly to do so. Berengar's land lay in ruins in many areas, and he needed time and effort to rebuild after the Bavarian occupation. However, before the man could admit his defeat, Berengar's serious expression turned to a warm smile and revealed some degree of hope to the Hussite representative. "However, just because I cannot spare troops does not mean I can't send you some form of military aid." After hearing this, the 3 men who had gathered looked up at Berengar with surprise. They did not know what form of assistance Berengar could aid them with. Before they could ask, Berengar continued on his train of thought. "I can supply you with firearms, cannons, gunpowder, and military advisors. It is the most aid I can afford to give you at the moment." Berengar's plan was simple. He would provide the weapons and training to the Hussites to overcome the Bohemian crown and their Catholic supporters. However, Berengar had no plans to arm the Hussites with arquebuses or 12-pound steel cannons. Instead, he planned to open up a separate production line in Vienna to make primitive cast-iron cannons and provide hand cannons to the Hussites. Though Berengar had sold the far more advanced arquebus to the Byzantines, his reasoning for doing was simply because his allies' interests to the east would not clash with his own for some time. Thus he did not have to worry about fighting a war with them. However, if he armed the Hussites with arquebuses and more advanced cannons when then the time came for him to demand compensation in the form of the Sudetenland and they refused to do so, he would be facing a force of pike and shot, rather than a late medieval army, which itself could pose some difficulties to overcome. Of course, The Hussites had no idea what he would demand in compensation for his military aid and thus were rather excited by the prospect of being armed by Berengar's factories. However, Ludic was a cautious man and knew such exceptional assistance would not come without a price. Thus, he asked Berengar to clarify what he desired. "That is more than enough to help us win this upcoming war, but I fear we will not be able to repay you for your kindness adequately, so I must ask, what is it that you desire in return for such gracious support?" Berengar was a shrewd diplomat and knew that the more the Hussites were in debt to him, the more likely they would be to acquiesce to his demands peacefully. As such, he responded to this question by essentially kicking the can down the road. "Do not fret, my friend. We can discuss payment for the military aid I provide you after you win your war and are in a better position to repay me for my kindness. For now, know that you have my support so long as it remains within the boundaries of the terms that I have provided." Though Ludic was not happy with this answer, he did not press the issue. Right now, the Hussites needed to worry about obtaining Berengar's aid, and any form of payment that Berengar might demand could always be done in installments within the future. Or so he hoped. He never would have thought that Berengar would demand the annexation of the regions referred to as the Sudetenland. Thus, the representative accepted Berengar's terms. "I thank you for your support. When can we expect your aid if you don't mind me asking?" Berengar was quick to reply to this, as he had already calculated the time needed in his head. "If I wish to send aid to your forces rapidly, then I will need to establish an industrial district in one of the cities closer to the Bohemian border. For that, I will need time. Give me 3 months at the maximum, and I promise you shall receive your first shipment of arms. As for the military advisors, I can send them immediately to aid you in your preparations for the war." Ludic smiled when he heard this news and bowed his head with respect once more. "I thank you on behalf of all Hussites, your grace." With this, negotiations with the Hussites over support for their upcoming war were secured. For the time being, Berengar gained an ally to take the attention off of himself and the German Reformation. By starting the Hussite Wars, the Catholic Church and its military orders would have one more war to fight before calling for a crusade against the German Reformation. In doing so, Berengar allowed himself time to prepare for the eventual day where he would be forced to fight the European armies at his doorsteps. A crusade was no laughing matter, and Berengar fully intended to expand his defenses, troops, and even his navy by that such an event occurred. Luckily for him, he happened to be reborn in the era where the Hussite Wars were about to transpire. Chapter 235: The Search for the Missing Princess. After Honoria's disappearance, the imperial family of the Byzantine Empire was in a state of panic. Especially the emperor, with his daughter missing, it meant that his alliance to France was in shambles. The French king held Emperor Vitranes responsible for his daughter's disappearance. He stated that if she were not found within a specific time, the de Valois dynasty would consider the betrothal broken. Emperor Vitranes was currently sitting on his throne nibbling at his fingernails, a bad habit he had picked up during his youth that he commonly resorted to when he was anxious. His daughter was missing, without the slightest clue as to her whereabouts. The French Prince Aubry had returned home bringing news of the reason for her disappearance, thus causing the French monarchy to make excessive demands of the emperor as compensation. If the emperor could not find his daughter soon, the betrothal would be broken, and so too would the military and economic alliance between the two countries. As such, he was in a complete and total state of panic. Vitranes let out his frustration by cursing his daughter in the middle of his throne room. "You fucking bitch, you better be alive and unspoiled, or I swear to God I will march through the gates of hell to discipline you." It was at that moment Honoria's older brother Decentius entered the room. He held onto a prostitute from the same brothel that Melissa had previously worked at. The investigation into Honoria's disappearance had led to the brothel, and this woman had seen Melissa leaving with the girl. From the looks of it, she had been roughed up by Decentius and his soldiers. There were many bruises on her face and across her body. Decentius tossed the woman to the floor as he began to yell at her. "Tell the emperor what you told me." Hearing the screaming voice of Decius, the woman instinctively flinched before stumbling over her words. "Basilia, the princess. The princess came into the brothel and then left with Basilia. That is all I know." Emperor Vitranes immediately pounded the armrest of his throne before raising his voice at the woman. "Who is this, Basilia? Where is she from? Does she have any family in the city? Where can I find her?" The woman began to curl back in fear. However, She was swiftly kicked by Dissentius repeatedly until she begged for mercy. I don't know. I don't even know if Basilia is her real name. Lots of girls at the brothel use false names. She never talked about herself or her family. I honestly don't know anything about her other than she worked at the brothel. Maybe some of her clients might know the truth, but I don't. This Basilia was none other than Melissa. Melissa was a bright young woman, at least in the streetwise ways. She changed her name for work and even wore a wig, thus her actual appearance was unknown. Now that she had left the city, it would be impossible to find out about her real identity. The emperor and his goons were completely back to square one. The intelligence that the prostitute had provided was practically useless. All they knew was that Honoria entered a brothel and left with a lady of the night. Vetranes was furious that his daughter was missing, and he had no viable information about her whereabouts. Thus he quickly lashed out at the woman kneeling beneath him. Get this whore out of my sight. With that, the guards dragged the woman out of the room and kicked her out of the palace. As for Dissentius, he kneeled before his father and made a solemn vow. I promise I will find the bitch, and bring her back to you. Hearing this, Emperor Vetranes tossed his goblet at his son, which smacked the young prince in the face and poured wine all over his body. After doing so, the emperor quickly chastised his son. Don't you talk about your sister that way. She may have run away and caused us immense trouble, but she is still your sister and a member of this imperial dynasty. Dissentius had heard his father call Honoria the same term not long before, and yet he was being so thoroughly humiliated for repeating the emperor's words. Dissentius gritted his teeth in rage. Despite this, he choked back the vile words he had planned for his father and forced himself to be calm. He realized that nobody in his family was thinking straight at the moment. Thus, despite the emperor's outburst, the second prince of the empire accepted the punishment. While this was ongoing, Arethes had walked into the room. He was fully garbed in his grand armor and knelt before the emperor next to Dissentius. After doing so, he quickly announced his reason for visiting. Your Majesty, I know these are hard times, and I do not wish to add to your concerns, but I have dire news from the city of Alexandria. The Mamluks have retaken the city and driven our forces out past the Suez. I know your daughter is missing, and you grieve for her absence. Yet, if you do not send aid to our forces in Egypt, all of our work from these past few years will go to waste. Hearing this news, Vetranes nearly chipped a tooth from the intense grinding he had begun. After listening to Arethes' words, he knew he had no choice. Arethes, you have been a good friend, and I greatly value the assistance you have provided in the search for Honoria. I understand your desire to stay behind in Constantinople and continue the search for my missing daughter. Yet, I am afraid only you and your army, which is now equipped with the weapons you have purchased from the West, can change the tides of war. Thus it is with a heavy heart I must order you to sail your armies south and crush the Mamluk Sultanate once and for all. Hearing this, Arethes was dismayed. He genuinely wanted to find Honoria as quickly as possible before something horrible happened to her. Yet, at the same time, he understood the emperor's reasoning and did not protest. He merely nodded silently before standing up and cupping his hands with a silent prayer. After doing so, he began to address the emperor. I pray to God in heaven that you can find the princess before she gets herself into trouble. I swear on my life and honor that I will do everything in my power to retake what we have lost in North Africa and send the Saracens back to hell where they were birthed. Hearing this, a bitter smile formed on Vetranes' face. Without his excellent friend Arethes to aid him during this crisis, he did not know how he would manage to hold on. Yet, he knew only Arethes' army would be able to crush the enemy in Egypt. Thus it was with a heavy heart that he sent his greatest friend and ally off to war once more. I pray for your victory, good Arethes. Go with haste and reclaim the long-lost lands of our mighty empire. After hearing this, Arethes saluted the emperor with a grim expression on his face. After doing so, he turned and walked out of the building. Seeing that his commanding officer was just ordered to war, Dissentius quickly followed in pursuit. However, he stopped at the entrance, where Arethes placed a hand on his shoulder. Dissentius, you must stay here with your father. Dissentius immediately felt taken aback and began to question Arethes' orders. What? Why? Am I not your Tormarches? Arethes sighed heavily before comforting the youth. You are by far the greatest of the officers beneath my command. However, you are also your father's son, and the emperor needs you and your assistance now more than ever. I fear what will become of him if he does not find your sister soon. God forbid something horrible happens to the poor girl." Dissentius wanted to protest this decision, but he could see that Arethusa had made up his mind, and as such, he removed the mighty stratego's hand from his shoulders before looking him in the eye with a serious gaze as he made a solemn vow. "I promise, whether my sister is alive or dead, I will find her, and I will bring her home." Hearing this, Arethusa smiled. He knew that under Dissentius's command, the search for Honoria would be under competent leadership. In doing so, he could worry less as he focused on his conquest of North Africa. After hearing this, the man turned away from the second prince and marched towards the harbor. He had a long journey ahead and a war to win. It would not be easy, but with the advantage of the arquebus and combined with the pike and shot strategy he had devised, in large part due to Berengar's assistance, he would be able to overcome the tremendous odds before him. As such, the search for the missing princess would continue. Despite having no leads towards her whereabouts, the Byzantine imperial family would spend a significant expense and effort looking for Honoria. They would never guess that she was on her way to a distant country solely because she had heard good things about a certain Austrian nobleman. Chapter 236 Honoria's Journey Part 4. After the debacle in the main harbor of Wallachia in the town known as Brăila, Honoria had confined herself to her room. After being touched inappropriately by one of the local boyars who threatened to take her life for resisting, the young and naive girl had much to think about. As such, she was stuck in her room with nobody for company except for Heraclius, who until recently had been ignoring her as punishment for her actions. The galley traveled at roughly 3 knots during cruising speed, in other words, approximately 3.5 miles per hour. As such, it was a long and slow journey to Austria. The distance between Brăila and Kufstein itself was roughly 1,008 miles. Assuming the crew rowed for 12 hours a day, it would take them approximately 24 days to arrive in Kufstein. Honoria had been trapped in the cabin for a total of 7 days at this point, and the crew had just begun to leave the borders of Wallachia and enter Hungary. She was greatly vexed by the boredom she had to suffer in the room. However, she never complained. After all, Agnellus was nice enough to help her out, despite knowing her position, for which she was thankful. Heraclius was commonly let out from the cabin so that he could fly about and catch prey. As such, he was in a perfect mood. After all, he flew at a speed of roughly 50 miles per hour. No matter how long it took him to catch prey, he could easily catch up with the ship. While Heraclius was enjoying himself, Honoria honestly had nothing to do except think about her life and daydream about what it would be like when she arrived in Kufstein. After encountering the boyar, she realized that there were people in this world who were not good-natured. As the princess thought about this, she realized that there was a possibility that Berengar was also a wicked man. However, she instantly put such thoughts aside because Arethusa had assured her that Berengar was benevolent and kind to his loved ones, and that gave her hope for the future. Still, there was a nagging suspicion that she would merely be trading one cage for another once she arrived in Kufstein. Despite the horrible situation, she found herself in a while in Brăila. The brief period she spent running about as free as an eagle was enough to fill her with wonder. She didn't want to be another caged bird. Now that she had spread her wings and learned to fly, she wanted to know more about life. The boyar's actions had spurred something inside Honoria, a belief that she should be self-sufficient. After all, if not for Heraclius's intervention, she could have been in danger back in Brăila. However, to do such a thing in this world was not easy. Especially for a woman. Thus she hoped that when she finally arrived in Kufstein, Berengar would provide her with the safety and security necessary to allow her to grow as a person. She did not wish to spend her life in Kufstein the way she had done while in Constantinople, which was confined inside the royal palace for her whole life as nothing more than a pretty face. Thinking about this, Honoria concluded that she could be utilizing her time aboard this ship in a more constructive manner. After all, there was much she could learn from these sailors. Thus the runaway princess exited the cabin after putting on her shawl and walked around the ship for a bit before making her way to the helm where Agnellus was currently located. Agnellus was currently steering the ship and noticed that the princess had arrived. Thus he put on a friendly smile as he began to chat with her. "Your Majesty, I was beginning to wonder when you would finally leave your seclusion. I hope nothing too serious happened back there in Brăila." Honoria gazed into the night sky above for a few moments in silence before voicing the concerns on her mind. "I've had a long time to think, and I have decided I don't want to be a bird in a cage anymore. I want to be an eagle that soars in the sky. So there was something I was wondering that you might be able to help me with? Hearing this bold statement, Agnellus was uncertain where this was headed. However, since the princess had asked him for help, he could not very well turn her down. Thus he begrudgingly inquired what it was she needed help with. Whatever you require of me, if I can fulfill it, I swear to do so. With this, a pretty smile formed on Honoria's luscious pink lips before she nodded her head in excitement. After doing so, her expression shifted to a pleading gaze as she made her request known. Teach me to sail. This was not a request that Agnellus was expecting, and thus it took a while for it to register in his brain. When he finally realized what the princess was asking him, he broke out into laughter. This reaction was not what Honoria expected, and thus she began to pout. Seeing the cute look on Honoria's face, Agnellus eventually stopped laughing and agreed to her terms. If it is something so simple, I would be happy to teach you to sail. But we have less than 20 days to go over everything, so the most I can give you is a crash course. To Honoria, this was good enough, and thus a charming smile formed on her lips as she thanked the jewelry merchant. Thank you. With that said, Agnellus spent the remainder of the night on the Danube teaching the princess of the Byzantine Empire how to sail a galley. The galley was not much of a sailing ship, it was more like a massive rowboat, so there were not too many things he could teach her about sailing on such a vessel. Still, Honoria went to sleep when the dawn rose with a satisfied smile on her face. There was not much to do while on board the vessel, but at least she could learn some valuable skills on the way to Kufstein. She slept for a total of 8 hours before waking up. When she finally opened her eyes, she noticed that Heracles was sitting next to her, watching over her as she slept. As such, the princess rubbed her eyes before stroking the eagle's glistening feathers. Good morning, Heraclius. The mighty eagle cawed in response to the treatment he received. Shortly after playing with the bird, Honoria heard a knock on the door, and a familiar voice followed. Your Majesty, are you in there? You have been asleep for some time. I have something for you to eat. When Honoria heard this, she quickly rushed to the door and opened it to see Agnellus's smiling face. In his hand was a bowl of meat porridge. There was also a wineskin alongside it. Honoria happily took a hold of the meal and thanked the man for his kindness. Thank you, Agnellus. I will make sure not to waste a drop. For whatever reason, seeing the princess happy made Agnellus happy. He had no way of knowing it, but he was starting to get attached to the beautiful young princess from the empire. As for Honoria, she had no lingering feelings for the man. To her, he was at best a friend. After handing Honoria her food, Agnellus thought of something and spoke his mind. We will be docking in Gyr soon. Why don't I show you how we dock the ship? Hearing this, a broad smile appeared on Honoria's face as she questioned the reality. Really? Agnellus merely smiled and nodded in silence. Hearing this news, Honoria had an excited expression on her face. She was eager to learn more about the functions of the ship, and thus she decided to devour her meal as quickly as possible so that she could learn the docking procedure. I should eat this while it is still warm. I'll be out momentarily, don't dock without me. Afterward, Honoria shut the door behind her, and Agnellus began to laugh at the girl's over-eager nature. To him, it was just simple docking, there was not much to be excited about. However, to Honoria, the most mundane actions seemed to hold significant meaning, and thus she took joy in everything she learned how to do. It was refreshing to have such a level of optimism around. Honoria ate the beef porridge and drank from the wineskin. To her dismay, it was not filled with wine but with water instead. Because of this, she began to pout as she hastily ate her meal. Heraclius, noticing that there was food nearby, immediately jumped by Honoria's side and stole the piece of cooked beef that was on her fork before he gulped it down for himself. The act of which shocked Honoria. She was visibly outraged by the bird's actions, instantly began to chastise her pet eagle. Heraclius, shoo! This is my food, get your own. To this, Heraclius responded by snagging another piece of her meat from Honoria's bowl and quickly devoured it with a smug expression on his face. The look in his eyes was asking Honoria a simple question. Who is going to stop me? Thus the gauntlet had been laid, and a contest was held between a princess and an eagle to see who could eat the meat in the porridge-filled bowl the quickest. If anyone else were to witness the sight, they would either be greatly entertained or deeply confused. One thing was sure, this bird was brilliant. Chapter 237, Revising Ship Designs. Berengar was currently within his study, sitting at his chair, and drafting new blueprints for a series of vessels he wanted to construct for his navy. He had been at this for many hours and once more was what one would call sleep-deprived. While the Lind-class ship of the line was the pinnacle of naval vessels, at least in those powered by the sail, it was pretty frankly overkill and would require a lot of resources, particularly that of oak. Such vessels were an enormous expense, and he could only build a few of them before venturing to the Americas. To put it simply, he had realized that the construction of such vessels was a waste of his limited resources, at least until he had begun colonization. As a replacement, Berengar was currently drafting plans for a 38-gun fifth-rate frigate that would become the standard warship for his fleet in the Mediterranean. The frigate was a fast and maneuverable single-deck ship. In the Mediterranean with its little wind, at least when compared to the Atlantic, such ships would be far more helpful in securing his power. They would also be fully capable of traversing to the New World and protecting Berengar's interests abroad. These 38-gun fifth-rate frigates would be armed with a total of 38 32-pound cannons and a few Schmidt guns on their swivels. With a fleet of these ships, there would be nobody who could challenge his authority in the Mediterranean. However, it was not simply frigates that he was designing, but also a clipper for trade and transport. The clipper was a high-speed and long-range vessel. So much so that it did not even need to be armed because there was no ship in this world that could catch it in pursuit. Thus they were the perfect design for merchant vessels and would allow him to rapidly exchange goods between his colonies and the fatherland in the future when he had a massive colonial empire. For the time being, these two ship designs would allow him to rule the Mediterranean and rapidly engage in trade with the various powers in the region. Berengar had shifted the design of the zinc-plated hull to that of galvanized steel and made it slightly thicker to protect against enemy cannon fire. These galvanized steel-plated hulls would be properly lacquered with a base layer of black paint and a white stripe over the gun deck. Overall, the ships would be highly effective in protecting against enemy fire and wood-eating parasites alike, thus increasing the vessel's lifespan and decreasing maintenance costs. As for his Lind-class ship of the line, it would be shelved until a time where he had the means to produce such mighty vessels in large numbers. Though it may disappoint Evio, the man was also practical, and as such, he would indeed be convinced to focus production on frigates and clippers. After finishing the blueprints for his new ships, Berengar quickly got to work on designing naval uniforms. As per usual, he focused on Renaissance-era designs for the clothing. In particular, he was inspired by the outfits worn by the Old English privateers known as sea dogs during the Elizabethan era from his past life. The uniforms were designed in the colors of black, charcoal, and gold. Now there was only one more thing to take care of, and this was of vital importance. A naval flag to fly would symbolize that his vessels were from the Duchy of Austria. At this point, the idea of naval and national flags were, for the most part, non-existent. Berengar had thought about this for quite some time and had a rudimentary idea in his head. Now that he was a duke, he thoroughly planned to change his coat of arms, and as such, he designed that first. Previously his coat of arms was reasonably simple, it was perbend sinister with the colors of black and gold. There was also a white bend in the center separating the two factions. Now that he was a duke, he intended on making something more elaborate. Thus he created a white field with a black eagle in the center. This eagle wore a gold crown and had a golden beak with a red tongue and white eyes. The eagle's wingspan had a visible golden ridge, and in the center of its body was his family's old coat of arms. The eagle's feet and talons were also in gold. After designing the new coat of arms, Berengar designed his naval flag, which would one day be the basis for his national flag. It was a Prussianized flag with a white center and a thin black bar on the top and bottom. However, unlike the Prussian flag, there was also a thin gold layer below that. In the white center, there was his new coat of arms within it. In the future, every Austrian ship, whether it be a military vessel or merchant's vessel, would fly this flag or some variant of it. It would symbolize that they were from the Duchy of Austria and were protected by its powerful navy. Any attack on an Austrian vessel would be considered by Berengar an act of war. With the ship designs finished, his naval uniforms, his new coat of arms, and his naval flag, Berengar had one primary task left. He had to think of a name for the frigate and its class. He thought deeply on this issue and decided to name the frigate after himself. The Berengar-class frigate. As for the clippers, they were not a warship, and thus he did not feel the need to give them a class designation. After taking care of business, Berengar leaned back in his chair and stretched his upper body while yawning. He had been in this seat for quite some time, and as such, desired to stretch his legs. Thus he rose from his seat and began to send the new designs to their respective builders. The naval uniform designs would go to the garment district in Kufstein. At the same time, the ship blueprints would be sent to Trieste, where Evio was currently located, and working on building Berengar's mighty shipyards. Berengar had already written a letter to the shipbuilder about his reasoning for why he would need to transition the work to the construction of frigates and clippers instead of the mighty ships of the line he had initially designed. He would attach this letter to the blueprints and send it with an armed caravan to Trieste so that his rivals could not intercept the critical schematics and steal it. He attached great importance to the construction of his navy, and had no intentions of leaking his ship designs to other nations. After sending out the designs to the people responsible for making them a reality, Berengar entered his great hall, where he sat down on his ducal throne. It was at this moment that Lind entered the room with their young child in her arms. Hans was growing by the day, and not just in size, but brain capacity too. The boy, who was not even a year old yet, had begun to speak more words than just "mama" and "dada," which thoroughly convinced Berengar that this child would be a genius. As Lind approached Berengar, their son reached out for his father and struggled within his mother's grasp. Seeing this, Berengar smiled and took the boy from his mother's arms before placing him on his lap. This caused Lind to pout in jealousy, as she always considered that to be her seat, especially while Berengar was on this ducal throne. Seeing the look on his lover's face, Berengar smiled wickedly before teasing her. "Why, Lind, my dear, are you perhaps jealous?" Lind, of course, looked the other way and pouted even further, refusing to acknowledge Berengar's words with a response. Hans looked at his mother and father and had a glimpse of understanding in his eyes. Thus he reached back out towards his mother and spoke to her. "Mama, mama." With this, Lind grabbed a hold of Hans from Berengar's grasp and then sat on Berengar's lap herself with a satisfied expression. In doing so, she petted Hans' strawberry blonde hair, which matched her own, and praised her son. "My baby boy is so caring and understanding." Berengar smirked at this but eyed the boy cautiously. This kid was too smart for his good. Somehow, he recognized that his mother was jealous that he was sitting on his father's lap and created a compromise. This degree of intelligence was terrifying when one considered that Hans was not even a year old yet. This just reinforced Berengar's belief that the boy was destined for great things. After sitting on his ducal throne for a while, Berengar grew tired. After all, he had burnt the midnight oil coming up with his designs and thus decided to get some rest. He made sure to kiss his lover and child on the cheek before sitting up, forcing them to stand with him. "I am going to go get some rest. I will see you two later." With that, Berengar departed to his bedchambers, where he fell asleep. As for Lind and Hans, they would continue their day as usual. Chapter 238, Honoria's Journey, Part 5. While the galley pulled into the town of Gyr, Honoria assisted in docking as she helped tie the ship off to the dock. In doing so, she felt a great sense of accomplishment. It was a simple and mundane task, yet it was the first time she had done something like this. The pretty smile on her face as she assisted the crew in docking the ship brought an atmosphere of optimism and happiness to the people aboard the vessel that they had not felt in some time. After docking in the town, Agnellis approached Honoria and gave her instructions. "This time, make sure to stay by my side. I don't want a repeat of what happened while we were in Wallachia." Honoria's smile faded, and she nodded her head with a solemn expression. After doing so, she followed Angelus into the town. Heraclius was flying overhead once more, watching over the girl. This time, the eagle made a mental note not to chase after prey while the princess was wandering about. Agnellis led Honoria into the town, where they began to shop for supplies. Throughout the time she had spent locked away in the captain's cabin, Honoria had time to think for herself. She realized if she immediately revealed her identity to Berengar, he would likely ship her back to Constantinople. The man might be a brilliant commander with a powerful army. However, he would not be able to face the pressure of the empire by himself. Thus she had opted to look for something to disguise her appearance and identity. While she and Agnellis were walking through the town, she noticed a little shop. This shop sold beauty products to women, and Honoria thought it would be an excellent place to check for something she could use to disguise her appearance. As such, She tugged a hold of Agnelis's arm and spoke to him. "I want to check out that store, maybe they have something useful for me." Seeing it was a woman's beauty store, Agnelis sighed before tagging along with Honoria. When Honoria entered the store, she was shocked to find the young woman who was selling the beauty products had sleek white hair that glistened as if it were oiled. She was pretty but in no way compared to the natural beauty that Honoria had. Seeing the woman's hair, brows, and lashes as white as snow, Honoria quickly asked the woman how she managed to do such a thing. "Excuse me? I was wondering, how did you get your hair like that?" Hearing a pretty young girl like Honoria question her about the fashion trend she was trying to start, the woman smiled before answering Honoria's with a proud expression on her face. "It is all thanks to this product right here." As she said that, the woman pulled out a can of pomade manufactured by Berengar's industry. Berengar had long since decided to sell the product for extra profit, and throughout the river trade on the Danube, some of his creations had made their way into Hungary. After showing off the fine wax-like substance, the woman continued her train of thought. "I had a brilliant idea to mix the fine white powder with the wax-like substance, and in the end, it created the brilliant snow-white hair you see on my head. It is just a damn shame most women are not interested in this style. Though I would suggest giving it a try. With your natural pale skin and mint-green eyes, I am sure it would enhance your beauty." Hearing this, Honoria quickly decided to buy a bit of both the fine white starch powder and the pomade. As such, she looked at Agnelis with puppy dog eyes signaling she wanted the items, and the man had no choice but to give in. Thus, he handed the woman the coins necessary to purchase the products. After doing so, the woman made another offer. "If you want your hair to be as white as mine for 5 extra coins, I can help you through the process." Hearing this, Honoria instantly agreed, and thus she sat down in a chair where the woman walked her through how to treat her hair so that it was a snow-white color with a silky texture. By the time they had finished treating Honoria's hair, brow, and lashes, she looked like a different person. Though her face was the same, the vast difference between her previous chocolate-colored hair and her now snow-white hair was substantial. With her ashen skin and mint-green eyes, the white hair complemented her natural features better than her natural hair color. After witnessing the transformation, Agnelis was shocked. He could not believe the young girl could be even more beautiful than she was prior. Though few people had seen Honoria in her life as a princess, it was still better to be safe than sorry, and thus her new disguise, while simple, had a significant effect. Honoria saw the expression on Agnelis's face and smiled with her pretty pink lips before asking the man the question on her mind. "Well, how'd I look?" The traveling jewelry merchant and sailor struggled to find the words to compliment the young girl in front of him. However, after careful deliberation, he eventually came up with the phrase, "Simply divine." Hearing such an incredible compliment, Honoria began to blush, her naturally pale skin flushed with a slight pinkish tone, complementing her new snow-white hair perfectly. The woman who had helped treat Honoria's hair began to pout. Her most recent customer had outshone her beauty by a wide margin. However, there was hope in her heart that Honoria could inspire her fashion trend, which should not naturally exist in this era. Without Berengar's interference by creating and selling pomade, powdering hair would not come into existence for some time. This was just another effect that Berengar unknowingly had on the timeline. After paying the woman for her help, Agnelis and Honoria left the shop and entered the streets. Now that Honoria had a disguise, she no longer cared about covering her appearance, and her beauty attracted many eyes. Despite this, nobody would ever guess that she was the princess of the Byzantine Empire. Despite the young beauty walking through the streets showing her stunning appearance, not a single man approached her. This was due to Agnelis's escort. He was a tall and strong man by nature and naturally intimidated anyone who thought to interact with the young beauty by his side. Thus she walked through the crowd with a gorgeous smile on her face, attracting the glances of all men and boys alike. Of course, Honoria herself was unaware of the lustful gazes that were cast her way and thus continued without a care in the world. Throughout the rest of the day at the town, Honoria followed Agnelis around, where he purchased the necessary supplies for the remainder of the journey. He even sold a few jewelry pieces to some of the local noblewomen, making a bit of a profit. Before long, he and Honoria returned to the ship. The crew was still busy venturing through the town going about their business. Well, aside from the many slaves who rowed the vessel, that is, they were bound to the ship. When Honoria was alone with Agnellus, she began to thank him for paying for her disguise. "Thank you, Agnellus, not just for paying for the products I wanted, but for everything you have done for me up until this point." Agents merely scratched the back of his head in embarrassment before responding to the princess. "It is no problem, after all, you are the princess of the empire. It is what I should be doing." However, to this response, Honoria merely shook her head. She had decided to hide her identity, and thus she could no longer have Agnellus referring to her by her real name or her title. Therefore, she began to inform the man of her intent. "I am no longer the princess of the empire, I ran away from home, and I have no plans on going back. From now on, you should refer to me as Valeria. I think it is best if I use a pseudonym in the future." Hearing this, Agnellus was shocked and immediately asked the question on his mind. "What about Count Berengar? Are you not going to reveal your identity when you arrive in Kufstein?" To this, Honoria responded with a wry smile on her face before revealing her plans for the future. "If I reveal my identity to Count Berengar immediately, he will most certainly ship me back to Constantinople, or at the very least inform my family that I am in Kufstein and keep me there until they arrive to transport me back to the palace. Instead, I will let him believe I am Valeria Zonera, a noblewoman from Antioch. After I have managed to make him fall head over heels for me, I will reveal my true identity. After all, a relationship built upon lies cannot stand for long." Hearing this, Agnellus was surprised how much the young girl had thought through her future since they departed from Constantinople. He had to say that she was maturing emotionally with each passing day, and that was a good sign. He, too, feared Berengar's response when he found out the runaway princess had fled to his territory. As such, Agnellus patted the girl on the head and smiled at her before saying the words on his mind. "I think that is a smart idea. I pray that your dreams come true." After saying that, Agnellus removed his hand and looked up at the moon in the sky before commenting once more. "It is getting late, I think you should get some rest. We still have a long ways to go before we reach Kufstein." Hearing this, Honoria smiled and nodded before leaving towards the allotted quarters. While doing so, she made sure to thank Agnellus once more. "Thanks again, I appreciate it." As she said this, Heraclius swept down from the sky and landed on her shoulder, where the two of them departed for their quarters. The eagle was not the least bit surprised that Honoria had changed her hair color and merely cawed at her while nodding his head in approval. The last thing Agnellus heard the princess say before entering the cabin was the young girl talking to her pet. "Thanks, Heraclius." With this, Agnellus merely shook his head and looked up at the moon once more before saying his thoughts aloud. "That girl is just too cute." Chapter 239 Lambert's official death eye. Since the death of Lambert, Berengar had hidden it from his family. The reason being he was afraid of the effect such news would have on his loved ones. More importantly, he did not want them to figure out that he had personally killed his brother in battle and claimed his skull as a drinking cup. This barbaric act was Berengar's final revenge on his little brother for the boy's wicked actions. However, he could not keep the secret forever, and thus Berengar had been hatching a scheme to inform his mother, father, and little sister of Lambert's death. He had just been too busy up until this point to do so. However, with his schedule free for the next few days, Berengar knew the time had come to announce Lambert's death and allow his family to have a good image of their lost loved one in their hearts and minds. As such, he had recently sent out a summons to his parents so that they may appear in Kufstein. It was on this day that they had finally arrived, and when they did so, they were amazed to see the changes that had occurred to their once humble barony. The last time they were in Kufstein, it was little more than an agricultural town. Now it was a thriving city, protected by mighty walls made of steel-reinforced concrete bricks. The sturdy star-shaped walls that bore dozens of cannons facing in all directions were an intimidating sight to the couple who had never thought that Kufstein would grow so rapidly in the year since their departure. Like all visitors, they had to wait in line until the city guards could vet them. Sigurd was quite impatient as he waited within his carriage. Eventually, he and his wife arrived at the city gates, where the guards flagged them down. The guard overseeing their arrival was a refugee from Saxony and had fled to Kufstein with his family during the initial outbreak of the war. Having no skills to speak of, he could only enlist in the army and hope for a spot in the garrison, which he was lucky to receive. Because of this, the man was entirely unfamiliar with Berengar's parents and did not immediately recognize them. Thus he uttered the words he had said 100 times on this day alone, as if he were speaking to any commoner who wished to enter the city. State your names and your purpose for visiting the city of Kufstein. While Sigurd had waited impatiently up to this point, he quickly began to scowl when the guards of the territory he once ruled did not even recognize his identity. Thus he proudly declared his position. I am Sigurd von Kufstein, father of Berengar von Kufstein. This is my wife Gisela von Kufstein, mother of Berengar von Kufstein. Hearing this, the guard's eyes opened with shock. He was not aware that Berengar's parents were still alive. His first instinct was to allow them to pass quickly. However, as a diligent guard, he knew he could not allow someone into the city just because they claimed to be related to the Duke. Therefore, he quickly gave them an order. Wait right here while I get someone to verify your identities. After saying that, he left the area. Shortly after that, he returned with a man equipped with brass-trimmed blackened plate armor. This man was an officer in the ranks of the garrison. The moment he arrived and noticed the former baron and baroness sitting in their carriage at the gates with an impatient expression, the man quickly slapped the grunt who had made Berengar's parents wait upside his helmet before bowing respectfully to Sigurd and Gisela. Apologies, Your Grace. Some of the members of the garrison are new to Kufstein and are unaware of your identities. You can quickly head to the castle. I will make sure you are unobstructed on your journey. This officer was a veteran of Kufstein's forces, dating back to when Sigurd ruled over the region. Thus he knew the appearance of his old liege like the back of his hand. On the other hand, Sigurd was greatly bewildered when he was referred to by the honorific, Your Grace, and quickly questioned the term as if his hearing had failed him. Your Grace? Sigurd and his wife were unaware of just how much progress Berengar had made in the past year. After all, they had retired to the countryside and maintained a peaceful life. They did not bother to check in on the current affairs of the realm. The officer looked befuddled. It took him a few moments to realize that the couple was unaware of the changes made to Kufstein and all of Austria during their seclusion, and thus he merely smiled before saying, It appears your son has many things to inform you about. Welcome home. With that, Sigurd nodded in confusion before ordering the servant who drove his carriage to press forward. To the castle, it appears there is much I have to speak about with my son. With this, the carriage rode forward and up to the castle, where Sigurd and his wife departed. At the gates, Berengar, Lind, Henrietta, and Hans were present to greet the couple. Gisela stiffened when she saw Berengar's appearance. The scar was above and below the eye patch that covered his right eye made her feel a sense of overwhelming dread. As such, Gisela quickly walked over to Berengar and grabbed his face into her hands. My poor baby, who did this to you? Berengar felt awkward as he heard this and coughed as he released himself from his mother's grasp. I was injured on the battlefield, but rest assured, I am fine. Though Gisela did not believe that Berengar was fine after being blinded in one eye, she accepted his words. For the time being, Berengar did not want to talk about it. Thus she quickly looked over at Henrietta, where she hugged her little daughter. My sweet Henrietta, it has been so long, and you have grown so much during this time. Henrietta was sheepish as usual and was silent as her mother grabbed a hold of her. After embracing her darling little daughter for a while, Gisela turned her gaze to Lind, where she stared at her coldly. That is until she saw the child in her arms. At that moment, the former Baroness's icy demeanor immediately melted, and tears of joy began to form in her eyes as her maternal instincts took over. She quickly reached out to Hans, where Lind begrudgingly handed her son over to his grandmother. Is this my grandson? Lind nodded with a warm smile on her face before declaring her thoughts. Yes, his name is Hans. He is an incredibly gifted child. Berengar smiled when he saw his father and mother for the first time in a year. The last time he had seen his father, the man was lean and worn. To put it simply, he was a husk of his former self. Yet during this past year, he had filled out his muscular body once more, and though he had aged quite a bit since Berengar first reincarnated into this world, the man had a healthy aura about him, as if he had recovered his lost vigor. Berengar approached his parents with a broad smile on his face. Father, mother, it is great to see you. I am glad to see that you are both healthy. I wish it were under better circumstances that I could summon you. Berengar had been deliberately vague about the reason for requesting their appearance in Kufstein, and when he said these words, a hint of worry flashed across his father's face. On the other hand, his mother was too enamored with her grandson to notice Berengar's words and had approached Lind, where she took Hans into her arms and spoiled the child. Having seen this, Berengar sighed before leading his parents into the castle. "I am sure you are both tired and would like some rest. Please follow me to the dining hall. I will have some food prepared for you." Sigurd and Gisela nodded and followed Berengar and the rest of the family into the dining hall, where they shared a pleasant meal. After it was over, Berengar tapped Lind on the shoulder and spoke his mind. "Lind, why don't you take Henrietta, my mother, and Hans away for a bit? I am sure you all have some catching up to do." Lind immediately understood Berengar's intent. As such, she nodded politely before leading Gisela and the others to a different section of the castle. "If you will follow me." Though Gisela was hesitant to leave her husband and son, Sigurd silently nodded, signaling her to follow Lind and their daughter. Once they had disappeared from earshot, Berengar asked his father a simple question to break the ice. "Should I get you something to drink? We have made significant progress with alcoholic beverages. I am sure that you will love whiskey." Hearing this, Sigurd nodded, and Berengar brought out a pair of glasses where he poured the precious substance into them before handing one to his father. Berengar proceeded to take a sip before expressing his thoughts to his father. "I see you have a lot of questions on your mind. You don't need to be so hesitant, ask away." Hearing this, Sigurd took a sip from the whiskey. In doing so, he began to cough up a storm. He had no idea that the liquid would have such a burning sensation. He had taken a big gulp and immediately began to regret it. After doing so, his cheeks began to flush, and he could feel his head spinning. Berengar chuckled at sight, and after a few moments, Sigurd collected his thoughts before asking the first question on his mind. "I was referred to by the term, Your Grace, when entering the city. Since when do I hold such a prestigious position?" Berengar's joyful expression came to a halt, and a solemn gaze was cast upon his father before answering the question. Truthfully, it was not too long ago. To make a long story short, the Austrian armies were defeated in Bavaria, where Duke Wilmar died in battle. After crushing our armies, the Bavarian troops marched into our lands, where they raped, pillaged, and burned a large chunk of it. In the process, they successfully laid siege to Vienna, where they executed Wilmar's sons and married off his daughters to God knows who. Only Conrad escaped, where he fled to my lands. In the process, I was named regent and helped him take back the duchy from Bavarian control. However, shortly after, the boy fell into a deep depression and took his own life, leaving me to clean up the mess. Some nobles rebelled, which I put down with ease, and Liudbert, the closest male relative of the late Duke Wilmar, acquiesced his claim to the duchy onto me. After summarizing the recent events, Berengar took a sip from his whiskey once more while waiting for his father to register the news. Sigurd was in shock. All of these things had happened to Austria while he was living a peaceful life in seclusion. He had no idea how Berengar had so adeptly moved his way up the feudal hierarchy from Viscount to Duke in such a small time frame. For the first time in his long life, he began to fear his son. Chapter 240 Lambert's Official Death 2. Sigurd stared at his son in silence for a few moments. During this time, all he did was slowly drink down the glass of whiskey. It was only after he had finished its contents that he began to speak the thoughts on his mind. "When you were but a child, I did not believe you would live to be an adult. After all, you were so sickly back then. Because of this fact, I had focused all of my efforts on raising Lambert to be my successor. I left you to the life of a lazy wastrel, and if I am honest, I did not care, because I was sure that you would die before reaching the age of majority. Despite this, you limped on, for years, engaging in pointless frivolities and smearing my family name. Yet, I tolerated it because I kept telling myself soon enough you would be dead, and Lambert would be my heir. When you fell ill a little over a year and a half ago, I assumed that was it, that you would be dead and in the grave and no longer be a black mark on my family's history. Yet once more, you surprised me. You crawled your way out of the grave and brought yourself back to life. In the days that followed, you became a completely different person, driven, intelligent, and capable. It was as if you were not even my son anymore. Within half a year, you had brought great wealth and success to Kufstein, the likes I had never anticipated. A year from then, you are now the Duke of Austria. To say that I was wrong about you is an understatement. While I thought Lambert was a worthy successor, it turned out that I was blind to his shortcomings. Rather than wait for you to naturally enter the grave, he poisoned you and made multiple other attempts on your life when you started showing yourself as a worthy member of this dynasty. The guilt I had for being a poor father to you and your brother forced me to concede my title and lands to you, and I now know that decision was the most excellent choice I have ever made in my life. With this in mind, I want you to be honest with me, for no matter what you tell me, I will be able to handle it. So allow me to ask you the question on my mind. Lambert is dead, isn't he? Having listened to this long-winded speech, Berengar felt his emotions fluctuate throughout the entirety of it. He had initially planned to tell his father that Lambert died gloriously in battle defending Christendom from its enemies. Still, after seeing the gaze in his father's blue eyes, he knew he could not lie to the man, and thus he opted to drink from his glass. Once he had finished the contents and had a mental buzz from the alcohol, he opened his mouth and revealed the truth. Lambert has been dead for some time now. The fool marched an army on our lands in an attempt to end my life and that of my family. So I marched an army of my own to meet him at Oberstdorf, where it turned into a chaotic slaughter. That knave took my eye from me, and in doing so, he paid the price with his life. Sigurd frowned when he heard this. However, his expression did not sink into despair, merely one of understanding. After sighing heavily, the man signaled for Berengar to fill up his glass, where Berengar proceeded to pour another round for himself and his father. The two men drank in silence for some time before Sigurd opened his mouth. "I'm sorry, Berengar." Hearing this, Berengar was stunned. He was not expecting such a reaction from his father to the news of his son's death. As such, Berengar decided to clarify his confusion. "About?" Sigurd had a grave expression as he continued his train of thought. "For everything. If I were a better father to the two of you, you would not have been forced into such a situation. It pains me to know that the grudge between you two brothers was so great that Lambert sought to kill you even after a chance at redemption. If I were a better man, I could have prevented everything bad that has happened to you." Berengar merely drank from his glass in silence for a few moments before responding. When he did so, he had a severe expression on his face. "You don't need to apologize. Everything that has transpired in my life has made me who I am. Without Lambert's attempts on my life, I would not be the man I am today. I fear to think about the life I would live if I had never awoken from my naivety." Berengar then pointed to his eye patch with a stern expression on his face and began to continue his speech. "This is a permanent reminder that I should never show mercy to my enemies. It is because I had a soft heart that I spared Lambert at my mother's request. I will never make that mistake again." Hearing this, Sigurd could tell that Berengar had been through a lot, and the extensive campaigns he had fought had hardened his resolve. The man before him was not the same son he knew a year ago when he left Kufstein to seek a life of leisure and seclusion. Sigurd could hardly recognize his son, but he was curious about what Berengar was thinking and how grand his ambitions were, and thus the former baron drank from his glass once more. Finishing its contents, he motioned for Berengar to fill it up, where the young duke poured more whiskey into both of their cups. After doing so, Sigurd asked the following question on his mind. "So is being duke enough for you? Or do you desire to be king?" When he heard this, Berengar decided to reveal some of his plans to his father. There were a few reasons for this. First and foremost, the man was family, and if Berengar's status was elevated, so too was his. Second, the older man had retired and given Berengar his realm. Thus, even if he was against Berengar's plans, there was nothing he could do. Thirdly, Berengar did not plan to reveal everything about his grand ambitions, only what would come next. With this in mind, Berengar responded to his father's question with a smug expression on his face. "For now, I will consolidate the gains that I have acquired throughout the past year. I will implement my reforms, expand the army, and establish a grand navy. When the time comes that Austria is capable of standing on its own, I will declare myself King of Austria. If the Emperor refuses to elevate my status from a lowly duke to a full-fledged king, I will wage war for my independence. No matter how many soldiers the Empire brings to battle, I will be victorious. In the end, I will be king, whether it is done peacefully or through bloodshed, it is inevitable." Hearing this, Sigurd was surprised that his son had such grand ambitions, to the point where he was willing to go to war for the right to call himself king. Then again, he understood that Berengar had the means to do so. After all, the man had retaken Austria from Bavarian occupation while at the same time preventing an invasion into Tyrol. A wide smile appeared on Sigurd's face as he thought about such a future. In doing so, he let his thoughts escape from his lips. My son, the King of Austria, to think that you would reach such great heights in this life. Do not disappoint me, my boy. With this, the father and son broke out into laughter as they switched to beer. Berengar spent the night introducing his father to all kinds of alcohol that he had made. From fortified wine to heavy beers and distilled spirits. While drinking, Sigurd gave his son one final piece of advice. My son, do not tell your mother or your sister the truth about Lambert's death. It would break their fragile hearts. Berengar nodded silently towards Sigurd's words. If it were not for his father being so forthright about the topic, he would have lied to him as well. With that said, Berengar drank more from the chalice in his hands. This golden chalice was not the usual skull chalice he drank from. He felt that it would be inappropriate to drink from Lambert's skull in front of his father. Thus he had prepared a different goblet. Later into the night, Berengar's other family members returned. By the looks on their faces, they had an exciting conversation, much like Berengar had with his father. However, the way Gisela and Lind were getting along was a good sign to Berengar. It would appear that they were able to hash out their difficulties. Thus, with his family's arrival, Berengar garnered their attention by clanging a spoon onto his golden chalice. After the others had turned their attention towards him, he began to speak the words he had prepared long ago. Mother, Henrietta, I have an announcement to make. There is no easy way to say this, so I will just come out and say it. Lambert is dead. I have received word from the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order that he has died gloriously on the battlefield defending the East from the heathens of the Golden Horde. Gisela dropped the cup in her hands in shock upon hearing this, and Henrietta began to tear up. Sigurd grabbed a hold of his wife's hands to comfort her in this time. The two women broke out into tears as they mourned Lambert's death, leaving Berengar, Sigurd, and Lind as the only ones aware of the truth. Berengar had concocted this statement so that his mother and sister would still look fondly on Lambert, even though he had continued to tread upon the path of evil well until his death. In reality, there was no redemption for Lambert. He had died in an attempt to murder his brother and ex-fiancée. If there was an afterlife, only eternal hellfire awaited him. Then again, if hell really existed, the two brothers would surely be united one day. Chapter 241 Salt and Glass. Now that Berengar had complete control of Austria, he had access to the Mediterranean via Istria. This presented a valuable opportunity to expand his business into two major areas: glass and salt production. The man was hard at work drafting factory blueprints to create facilities in Istria to mass-produce such materials. The first object on his list of designs was what was once called the glass cone in his previous life. An invention used in England during the 18th century for making glass. Due to technological limitations, such as a lack of electricity, Berengar was incapable of using modern techniques like float glass to manufacture ample glass supplies. Thus, he had to dig back further into his memory to make a glass industry from scratch. If Berengar wanted to outcompete the Venetians in the glass trade, who at this point were the major glass producers of the world, then he needed a superior product. Luckily, he knew of an invention from the late 17th century that made England the world's top glass merchant. This invention was known as lead glass in the modern era, also known as crystal glass due to its superb clarity. This glass was invented by adding a minimum of 24% lead, oxide to the mixture. With this technique, Berengar could create a superior glass quality compared to the Venetians and slowly take over the market. However, drinking from lead glass could be harmful, and lead was a valuable resource in the production of munitions. Thus, Berengar had opted to replace the lead, oxide with zinc oxide instead. This created a similar level of clarity within the glass, but it was lighter weight and safe to drink from. Berengar had an overabundance of zinc due to its content within his mines and those of the lords underneath his rule. Thus, he was more than happy to make glass this way. Berengar intended to produce such materials in glass cone factories, where after its production, it would be manufactured into various objects. A glass cone furnace was powered by coal and had a large central furnace surrounded by smaller furnaces to ensure that the glass did not cool off quickly. Within the center of this formation was a work area for the glassblowers to shape the glass into the final product. He intended to build a large factory containing several of these glass cone furnaces where he could produce a sufficient amount of glass. By doing this, Berengar planned to dominate the glass trade and add another industry to his portfolio. On the other hand, the saltworks would be much easier. All he needed to do was create a large salt evaporation pond, also known as a salt pan. Essentially, all that was required was to create a shallow area where seawater is trapped and left to evaporate in the sun. After the water was evaporated and the salt remained, laborers could quickly gather it, where it would then be treated and purified into proper edible salt. The byproducts left over would be valuable chemicals that can be used elsewhere in Berengar's industry. If he could set up several of these saltworks across Istria, he could gain access to a large amount of salt and thus help him gain access to the salt trade. Though he would not be able to dominate the industry like the others he had entered into, it would still add another means of revenue to his pockets which would aid him in the long run. After spending half a day designing these things, Berengar ventured to the parliamentary building that contained the House of Lords. Though it was merely a formal procedure, he needed their approval to begin the production of the two trades he had in mind. The moment he entered the House of Lords, the various men he had assigned to the task or were voted in by other members of the nobility all stood up from their seats as a sign of respect. It was not every day Berengar ventured into Parliament. Usually, it was over something important that he wanted voted upon right away when he did so. Thus, when Berniger stood at the podium, all of the men gathered were waiting patiently for the words he began to speak. After getting his files in order, Berengar cleared his throat before addressing the members of the nobility. My lords, I have come here today to introduce a set of the legislature that needs your approval. In essence, I will be entering our duchy into the glass and salt trades. I require your consent to construct various facilities within the province of Istria that will provide us with a large amount of the two materials. With my production methods, we can enter the glass trade and eventually dominate the market due to the clarity and quality of the glass produced. The wealth that is afforded to the Venetians via their stranglehold over the market shall shift to us. When the lords heard this, they began to debate among themselves. One of them raised a serious concern over the matter of getting into the glass trade, especially after hearing Berengar's ambitions to dominate the market. With all due respect, Your Grace, do you think it is wise to steal the glass market from the Venetians? It will surely invoke their ire. We might even potentially be faced with war because of this. Berengar was calm and collected when he heard this information. The Venetians were not a threat to him. In this timeline, the Republic of Venice, much like the one in Genoa, were vassals of Italy's kingdom and, by extension, the Holy Roman Empire. They maintained a significant degree of autonomy, much like other larger states within the empire, such as Austria. Thus, Berengar boldly declared his stance on the issue. If the Venetians are bold enough to declare war on us over a bit of competition in the glass trade, then I will march on their capital with the full force of my army and force them into subjugation. As for their navy, when I have constructed my fleet, I will lay it to waste. However, I doubt they have the gall to declare war on us so rapidly. By the time they realize they have lost the market, we will already be in a dominant position. Thus, we have nothing to fear from angering the Venetians. Berengar was not afraid of war or making enemies. After all, he had spit in the face of the Vatican and caused a reformation in Germany, which had made all of his neighbors except for Bohemia hostile towards him. The only thing keeping his enemies from invading Austria was the fear of a defeat. After Berengar crushed the Teutonic Order and the Bavarian army, few were bold enough to venture into Austria until they could figure out countermeasures to his terrifying weapons. Hearing his bold stance on the issue, the other lords mainly were persuaded. After all, many of them had marched to war alongside Berengar and knew, though boastful, he was not arrogant. They did have the means to defeat Venice. As for his claims about the naval power they were creating, well, in their eyes, it was yet to be seen how effective Berengar's fleet would be. Thus, after some deliberation, the House of Lords unanimously approved of the measures. Gaining dominance in the glass market would bring an absurd degree of wealth to Austria, and thus the potential gains far outweighed the potential risks. With his plans approved, Berengar stayed around and discussed some of the other topics of interest. Though many minor things were discussed, ultimately, it was all relatively insignificant, and thus, Berengar returned to the castle in Kufstein after some time. Legislating laws was up to the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and Berengar would for the most part not get involved in such affairs until it was placed on his desk where he could either sign it into law, revise the bill and send it back to the House of Lords for approval, or veto it. A fairly streamlined process gave him significant control over the duchy while still taking the weight off of his shoulders of micromanaging every detail. After returning to his home, Berengar had a meal with his family and then took a bath with Lind before returning to his room. After closing the door, Lind quickly latched onto Berengar and began to kiss him passionately while the two began to undress. After doing so, Lind made a request of Berengar that he was not expecting. Would it be too much to ask, to give Hans a little brother or sister? Hearing this, a wide smirk filled Berengar's immaculate visage as he responded by pressing Lind down on the bed and having his way with her. Initially, he planned to wait a while to produce more children, but he would not refuse his lover since she was asking for it. As such, Berengar spent a large portion of the night trying to impregnate his lover once more. Thus Berengar ended the day with a wide grin on his face. Whatever future troubles may appear, he would answer them with firm resolve. Chapter 242 The Princess Arrives the First. Nearly a month had passed since Honoria first entered the Danube, and with it, she had finally arrived in Kufstein. Since her adventure in Hungary, she had spent much time on the ship learning to sail and going over the German language with the translator that Agnelis had brought with him. When she was not on the boat learning to sail, sleeping, or learning the German language, she was venturing through the villages they passed through, talking to locals, and experiencing life. By now she was fairly proficient in the use of the German language, though she would still have a tough time holding an extended conversation without the translator. Despite this, she was fairly certain she could still communicate with Berengar when she arrived. After all, the two of them were nobility, and thus should know Latin. Now that she had finally arrived in Kufstein, she made sure to dress in her prestigious apparel before venturing towards the castle with Agnelis in tow. Over the past month, she had devised a plan to get on Berengar's good side and had discussed it at length with Agnelis. Her goal was simple. She would approach Berengar under the guise of being a noblewoman from Antioch named Valeria Zonera, seeking to establish trade with Berengar regarding jewelry. After all, Austrian jewelry was starting to become popular in the market due to its high quality and new materials such as white gold. It had become highly desirable for the nobility among the Danube River to purchase. This has initially been Agnelis's reason for coming to Kufstein. Thus, this little scheme of hers did not require anything extra of Agnelis other than for him to play along with her little ruse. The galley pulled into the river inn, which separated Kufstein's city, and parked at a port designed for river merchants. The moment the ship came to a stop, Heraclius flew off from Honoria's shoulder and into the sky above. Where he was headed to, Honoria did not know. Regardless, he would sure to be back soon enough. Thus Agnelis and Honoria followed suit and stepped off the vessel, where Agnelis gave Honoria a stern warning. "All right, I am going to go register with the dockworker. Stay here, and don't get yourself into any trouble." The moment Agnelis said this, Honoria rolled her eyes before back sassing him. "I know the drill. We have done this a dozen times already." Agnelis merely laughed at Honoria's attitude before departing to do as he said he would. As for Heraclius, he had flown high into the sky well above the river, where he landed on the pane of an open window. This window belonged to Berengar and was the window to his study within his castle where he was currently sitting. The moment the bird landed on his window, Berengar looked over and was shocked. He knew this bird to be an Eastern Imperial eagle, yet they were not found in Austria. Kufstein was well out of the bird's range. He could understand if it was a golden eagle, but this bird from the Eastern Mediterranean should not be here in the Alps. As such, Berengar's natural curiosity came over him, and he slowly approached the majestic eagle, where he lifted out his hand for it to sniff. In doing so, Heraclius gave Berengar a curious sight as he began to talk to the bird. "Hey there, little fellow, what are you doing here so far from home?" The bird instantly recognized Berengar's status by the extravagant attire and the fact that he was in the castle's study. Thus he knew this man was likely Honoria's target and decided to provide some assistance to his master. The bird was quite surprised to see the man while taking a routine flight and had thus approached Berengar of his own free will to gauge his character. Seeing that Berengar did not shoo him away, and was instead friendly, left a good impression on the eagle. However, Berengar's words that came next greatly shocked it. Berengar had been staring in the eagle's eyes this entire time. While he was observing Heraclius, he recognized that the eagle was also sizing him up, and thus he laughed at this. My, aren't you quite the intelligent bird? Tell me, have I gained your trust yet?" Very few humans ever spoke to Heraclius as if he could understand them, only Honoria did so, and Berengar had quickly found out the bird's intellect. Thus Heraclius was just as curious with Berengar as he was with him. "Tell me, my feathered friend, are you here on your own? Or did someone bring you here? I find it hard to believe a mighty eagle like you would venture this far into the Alps on your own accord." Hearing this, Heraclius merely cawed before flying out the window and down towards the docks. Seeing where the bird was headed, Berengar chuckled, and shook his head before saying his thoughts aloud. "All right, I'll bite." Thus Berengar quickly gathered his medallion cape and slung it over his right side before placing his cavalier hat upon his head. Afterward, he promptly departed from the castle and followed the bird down to the docks. Heraclius had made sure to hover in the air and guide Berengar towards Honoria, who was waiting patiently by the ship she had arrived on. After a short journey through the streets of Kufstein, Berengar found his way down to the docks, where he saw Heraclius land upon the shoulder of a gorgeous young woman. This woman had white hair, brows, and lashes. While having pale skin and mint-green eyes, she appeared to be a beautiful albino at first glance, and this immediately caught Berengar's interest as he gulped the saliva down his throat. When Heraclius landed upon Honoria's shoulder, an elegant and pretty smile spread across her perfect face as she petted the eagle on the head while addressing him. "Heraclius, where have you been? We have only just arrived, and you already wandered off." Heraclius cawed in response to this and pointed his head toward Berengar, who had just arrived in front of the beautiful princess. It was not until this moment that Honoria had noticed Berengar's presence and was taken back by his handsome demeanor. There could only be one man in Kufstein dressed so lavishly and having such a perfect appearance in her mind. While dressed in his black and gold Elizabethan attire, with a cavalier hat, the embellished eye patch added to his striking figure, rather than take away from it. As such, Honoria was attracted to Berengar to the same degree he was to her. Berengar put on a charming facade before creating a subject to talk about with the attractive young woman standing in front of him. He decided to speak in Latin for one simple reason. He could tell by the woman's attire that she was from the Byzantine Empire, and though Greek had replaced Latin as the primary language of the empire, she would surely know Latin as a noblewoman. Berengar's Latin was a little rusty, but as a nobleman in the Holy Roman Empire, he spoke it to a degree. Thus, he was able to communicate with the woman effectively. Heraclius, a fitting name for a majestic creature like the Eastern imperial eagle. Emperor Heraclius was a great man to depose the despot Phocas and lead his armies to victory against the Sassanids to the east. As Berengar said this, he prayed that his knowledge of Byzantine history in his previous life was the same as it was in this timeline. Luckily for him, he appeared correct because the girl covered her mouth in shock as she heard this. She had no idea that the Count from Kufstein would be so well educated in her own people's history. Honoria was also surprised that Berengar's Latin was fluent. Though he spoke in the church's dialect, it was still surprising to see a German nobleman pronounce the tongue that she and her ancestors spoke with such proficiency. The girl was greatly enamored by her first impression of the man in front of her. Having seen that Honoria was thoroughly ensnared by his charms, Berengar took the time to introduce himself. "Apologies, my lady, I should have introduced myself first. I am Berengar von Kufstein, Duke of Austria. Might I have the honor of knowing your name?" It took Honoria a few moments to process her thoughts. When the princess heard Berengar refer to himself as a duke, her heart fluttered for a moment. However, eventually, she managed to calm her beating heart before responding with what she had planned to say for some time now. "I am Valeria Zonera. I am but a minor noblewoman from Antioch here to engage in the jewelry trade with Kufstein. Your gems are legendary, and I would very much like to sell them in the empire." Hearing this, Berengar sighed heavily within his mind while thinking to himself, if only she were a princess. After hearing Honoria was a minor noblewoman and not a princess, he had lost interest. Despite her exceptional beauty that was on par with Linda's and Adela's, Berengar had told himself he would not take in another girl unless there were significant benefits tied to it, like an alliance with a foreign kingdom. Thus Honoria had unknowingly shot her initial chances into wooing Berengar in the foot without realizing it. Instead, Berengar controlled his animal instincts and shifted Honoria to the back of his mind into the category known as strictly business. Thus he no longer gazed at her lustfully and instead put on a friendly smile as he addressed her business concerns. "Well, you are not wrong. We have the finest gems and jewelry here in Kufstein. I would be more than happy to negotiate with you about a trading agreement. How about you come back with me to the castle, and we can have a discussion about this over a hot meal? Honoria noticed the shift in Berengar's gaze as she stated her identity and felt as if she had somehow said something that displeased him, but she could not tell what. Ever being the wise bird, Heraclius realized that Honoria had ruined Berengar's initial impression of her and lightly pecked at her cheek, trying to warn her that she was friend-zoning herself. Unfortunately, he could not speak the human tongue and could not inform the princess of her mistake. Thus Honoria merely shrugged the eagle off of her as she proceeded to bow gracefully to Berengar. It would be my pleasure. Hearing this, Berengar smiled and led her back to his castle. He had no idea that this Lady Valeria was Princess Honoria in disguise, and by now, he had mostly lost interest in trying to snatch her for himself. On the other hand, Honoria had other plans. She fully intended to win Berengar's favor, especially now that she had seen him in person and was intensely infatuated with him. Thus an awkward lunch was about to occur between Berengar, Lind, and Honoria, as the trio introduced themselves over a meal. Of course, Honoria had utterly forgotten that she had promised to wait for Agnellus behind at the dock, and thus this would greatly outrage the man when he found out he had been left behind so that the princess could dine with the duke. However, he was registering the boat with the dockmaster for the time being and was unaware that Honoria had left with Berengar. Chapter 243 The Princess Arrives the Second. After arriving in the castle with a new, young, beautiful woman tied around his arm, Lind was unhappy, to say the least. She could not take her eyes off of Berengar for a single moment without him chasing after the next prettiest girl in the room. Before Berengar even explained the situation to her, he had himself, Honoria, and Lind sit down at the dining table, where the best food in Kufstein was prepared for them. While they waited, Lind stared furiously at Berengar, and this did not go unnoticed by Honoria. However, Honoria saw Lind as competition in the war for Berengar's affection. The only question on her mind was whether or not Lind was Berengar's fiancée or his mistress. As such, she casually approached the conversation by complimenting Lind to Berengar. "Your Grace, your wife is lovely, you must be quite proud." Lind was no fool. She immediately understood Honoria intended to inquire about her identity, and thus she responded on Berengar's behalf, like a lioness protecting her alpha from an unknown stray. "Our marriage is a happy one. We even have a child together, a beautiful baby boy named Hans." After hearing about Hans, Honoria instantly knew Linda's identity. She was the lover Arethes had told her about. However, she was confused about why she lied and said they were married when they weren't. As such, she posed the question to Berengar. "I am sorry, I heard you were engaged, but I did not know you were married. When did you two get married?" Knowing that Lind was the lover and not the fiancé, Honoria felt she had a greater chance of securing a spot in Berengar's heart and quickly shot back at Linda's bluff, which caused Lind to be visibly outraged. She thought to herself, "Whoever this bitch is, she has done her homework." Berengar instantly knew that the two girls were fighting, but there was not a whole lot he could do to stop it, and thus the best thing a man should do in this scenario was clarify the issue at hand before it spiraled further out of control, while at the same time placating his lover with affection. "Lind is not officially my wife, but if I could have two wives, she would be one of them. She is my lover, the mother of my child, and my partner. We consider ourselves bound by our souls, so in a way, you could say that we are married, right, honey?" Lind instantly rolled her eyes at Berengar. He was not usually the diplomatic type. The fact that he was approaching this little feud as a mediator meant he had some interest in the girl, or so she thought. Honoria, on the other hand, acted as if she was shocked about the news. Though she knew Berengar had two women in his life, she felt the need to criticize him. If his fiancée was as beautiful as Lind, wasn't he just being a bit too selfish? As such, she let her jabs fly. Of course, it was all dealt with a sultry smile and a seducing voice. "Why, Berengar, I did not know you were that kind of man? Tell me, if you already have two women, then why not three? Or four?" To this, Berengar scoffed as he quickly drank from his skull chalice. He was well aware of the glares he was receiving from Lind at this moment, and thus he decided to approach this landmine without setting it off. "My love life is already complicated enough. The only way I would entertain adding a third woman into my life would be if she was a princess of a powerful foreign kingdom. That way, I could gain something from the massive headache I would receive, such as a political alliance. With this, Honoria instantly realized why Berengar stopped looking at her with passion when she told him she wasn't a princess. She could only imagine the trouble he must have by making two women happy. A third would be a nightmare, but she was undeterred. After all, she was, in fact, a princess. Heraclius heard this and started cawing in a manner that resembled laughter. He did this while giving Honoria a gaze that displayed his thoughts for everyone to see. Those being something along the lines of, "See, you should have been honest from the start." However, Honoria would not so quickly reveal her status as a princess. Instead, she inquired about Berengar's intentions and thus asked him another question. "I have a hypothetical question for you, if you don't mind answering?" To this, Berengar merely nodded his head before replying. "Go ahead, as long as it is not something too personal. I do not mind answering your questions, Valeria." With this, Honoria put on a pretty smile and rested her gorgeous face in the palm of her hand while staring at Berengar with a longing gaze. "Suppose a princess runs away from her marriage and shows up on your doorstep because she had heard legends about you and was fascinated with the idea of being with you instead of her pillow biter of a fiancé. What would you do?" To this, Berengar chuckled and responded with a sly response of his own. "This pillow biter wouldn't happen to be the Crown Prince of France, would he?" Honoria's surprised expression told Berengar all he needed to know about the identity of this girl. After all, he had a conversation with Arethes about Honoria being upset because she had a gay fiancé. Now Berengar had not suspected Honoria until the moment she brought up this hypothetical. The reason it so quickly clicked in his mind was twofold. 1. He seriously doubted there were more than a single openly homosexual prince in all of Europe. Secondly, he had heard from Arethes that Honoria was a beauty no less gorgeous than Lind. Considering Lind was in the top 1% of women he had seen in the entirety of his 2 lives, he felt it was improbable that this woman would bring up a hypothetical that so perfectly described Honoria's situation while being as beautiful as the princess was said to be. At the moment, it was only a suspicion, and Berengar had no definitive proof that the young girl in front of him was Princess Honoria, but all signs pointed to it. She was roughly the same age as Honoria, she came from the Byzantine Empire, she was as beautiful as Honoria was said to be, and she just so happened to describe a so-called hypothetical that matched Honoria's situation perfectly. Then again, as far as Berengar knew, Honoria was still within the empire, thus unless he could confirm her disappearance, he would not be able to say with certainty that the woman before him was Princess Honoria. So rather than out the girl, he merely responded with a non-answer. As such, he put a sly smile on his face before answering Honoria's question. That would depend. Honoria was still recovering from her shock that Berengar knew about her engagement, so it took her a few moments to adequately address Berengar's statement. Depend on what? To this question, Berengar took a drink from his skull chalice before responding. It depends on whether or not I live up to the hype. So let me ask you a hypothetical question of my own. Let's say you are this hypothetical princess who has run away from her marriage and her home to come to visit me to see if I am her dearest Prince Charming. From what you have observed about me until now, do I match the image you had in your head? In response to this question, Honoria quickly drank from her chalice before answering Berengar's question. It is too early to tell. To this, Berengar merely chuckled while Lind eyed Berengar and Honoria's actions closely. She could easily tell what mind games Berengar was playing with this so-called Valeria Zonera. After all, Lind had a mind for intrigue, and if Berengar could guess her identity so too could Lind. She was also privy to the conversation with Arethes about Honoria's dissatisfaction with her betrothal. This created a deep sense of worry in Linda's heart, not because Berengar might fall for the princess, she was already willing to share with Adela, and a third girl wouldn't hurt. It was because if this girl was Princess Honoria, then she had just brought trouble to their doorstep. The kind of trouble that Berengar might not be able to get out of, and nothing worried Lind more than her lover and her son's safety. Lind knew she would have to investigate the real identity of this young woman who presented herself as Valeria Zonera, though it would be difficult. After all, her intelligence network did not reach the Byzantine Empire, and if Honoria indeed ran away from home, it would be a tight-lipped secret. The damage such a scandal would cause to the prestige of the emperor and his dynasty was no laughing matter. If the emperor could not properly control his own family, how could he possibly control an empire with any degree of competency? Of course, Honoria had no way of knowing that Berengar and Lind would dig into her background, It might take some time and effort, but with enough elbow grease, they could very well find out the truth of the matter, and when they did, hopefully Honoria had entrenched herself into Berengar's heart by then. Else she would be shipped back to the Empire to await her fate. Thus the conversation at lunch would continue for some time. After all, they had only just begun to break the ice with one another. Chapter 244. The Princess arrives. The third. While Honoria was visiting Berniger for lunch at his castle, Agnellus eventually returned from the dockworker with whom he registered his arrival. Of course, he had to pay a fee for using the dock, but that was not an issue for the veteran merchant. What was an enormous issue was that the moment he returned to his galley, the princess he had been tasked with protecting by his sister was nowhere to be seen. This caused an immediate sense of panic to fill in the man's gut. Though he technically said he would help her until she arrived in Kufstein, he had at least wanted to make sure the young woman made it to the castle okay. After all, if she was going to be meeting with Berengar, he too wanted to meet with the man so that he could negotiate access to Berengar's jewelry trade. Both he and Honoria agreed beforehand that he would accompany her and pretend to be her servant, which would allow him to negotiate with Berengar for the jewelry business while maintaining the girl's cover. Yet before he had the opportunity to take advantage of that, the girl just up and disappeared on him. Thus Agnellus began to search around the city of Kufstein for Honoria quite frantically. He would never forgive himself if something happened to her on his watch. As for Honoria, she was currently eating lunch with Berengar and Lind. It was utterly unknown to her that her cover was already blown, at least enough to warrant a full-scale investigation into her identity. As such, she was enjoying her time getting to know Berengar, who was more than happy to oblige the girl he thought may very well be the Byzantine princess. To Berengar, it was better to keep the girl he suspected to be the princess of the empire by his side and provide her safety and security in his lands until he could verify her identity. The reason for this was simple. If Valeria turned out to be Honoria, and he turned her away on the suspicion that she was the princess, the Byzantine Empire could blame him for any misfortune that might befall her after he had kicked her out of his domain. After all, the more Berengar talked to Honoria, the more he realized she was just a naive girl who had only recently come to know the cruelties of the world. For example, at this moment, Honoria did the unthinkable. She asked Berengar about a serious matter that a person would typically avoid discussing in their first meeting with someone who had a noticeable disability. So tell me, Berengar, how is it that you got yourself that fashionable eye patch? The food had yet to arrive when Honoria asked this question, which meant that they had been speaking to one another for less than half an hour. Hearing this question, Berengar put on a bitter smile as he tried to deflect the painful memories of how he nearly lost his life in battle. Let's just say I was wounded in battle, and we should leave it at that. Though Berengar often reflected on his mistakes, as that was the only way to learn from them. He did not enjoy others learning of them. As such, his propaganda network had spun quite the tale about how Berengar found himself surrounded by multiple Teutonic knights and, through sheer force of will and overwhelming skill, managed to overcome the odds, losing his eye in the process. In truth, in a moment of recklessness, Berengar charged beyond his lines and into the fray, where he lost his trusty steed and suffered a grievous injury in single combat against his brother before blowing the kid away with a pistol. Despite this unflattering truth, the battle at Oberstdorf was too chaotic for anyone to witness how Berengar was indeed injured, so he used his injury to paint a picture of invincibility in the face of immeasurable odds. After all, if anyone could pull off such a feat, it was surely Berengar. Despite having made up such a story to conceal his costly mistake, Berengar did not feel like lying to the girl about how he was injured and thus tried to kick the can down the road to inform her at a later date. That is, should they ever grow close enough for him to reveal the humiliating truth of his injury. However, Honoria didn't seem to take the hint and continued to press about the issue. You lost it in battle? That is fascinating. Who were you fighting? Do you still have the eye, or is it completely removed? Can I see it? Meanwhile, Heraclius merely shook his head at Honoria's response and looked at her as if she were an idiot. If an eagle like him could tell Berengar did not want to talk about the issue, why could this girl not see it? As such, the mighty eagle began to peck at Honoria's face lightly. It was not enough to break her skin, but it was his way of saying that she was making a mistake. Honoria reacted by shoving Heraclius to the side, and the eagle rolled his eyes in response. With an expression on his face that said, "It is your funeral." Luckily for Berengar, a distraction came in the form of food, and as such, an excited expression appeared on his face as he announced its arrival. "I am afraid we will have to discuss this some other time. The food has arrived. I hope it is to your liking." Honoria took one look at the food on her plate and thought it was relatively simple, at least when considering the fine Byzantine cuisine she was used to. However, the moment she bit into the pork schnitzel, she felt as if her taste buds had entered heaven, and she could not help but moan in pleasure. After eating a few bites of the food in front of her, Honoria exclaimed her thoughts aloud, having already completely forgotten about her question. "I had no idea Austrian cuisine was so delicious." To this, Berengar smiled proudly before responding to her comment. "Well, I am glad you enjoy it. My chefs work very hard to prepare the best cuisine for myself and my guests to dine on." At this point, Honoria had begun digging into her food, completely forgetting the reason she was officially in Kufstein, to begin with. That is until Berengar brought it to her attention. "I suppose we should get down to business now that the food has arrived. How much of my jewelry can I expect you to purchase, and what is the price you offer for it?" The moment she heard this, Honoria dropped her fork in shock and began to panic as she voiced her thoughts aloud. Agnellus, Berengar and Lind were confused by her actions. As such, Berengar tried to figure out what she was talking about. "I am sorry, who?" It was at this moment Honoria realized she had made a scene and calmly collected herself before speaking. "Agnellus, he is my subordinate, he handles the business affairs. I accidentally left him at the docks." Berengar desperately wanted to facepalm at the girl's remarks. Honoria had spent all this effort to create a cover story, and in the end, she left behind a critical asset at the docks, one that could seemingly verify her identity in the event there were some suspicions. Berengar did not know who this Agnellus was or what his relationship with the girl was, but he figured it could not be anything good. Now that Honoria was in Berengar's lands, she was under his protection, and as such he wanted to get to the bottom of this. If Agnellus had done anything inappropriate to this girl during their travels, he would be severely punished. As such, the young duke clapped his hands, and a couple of guards stationed nearby walked over to him. As they did so, they saluted their liege by pounding their breastplates and standing at attention before Berengar gave them their orders. "Search for this Agnellus from the Byzantine Empire within the city, and bring him to me. He is probably looking for the girl as we speak, so it should not be too hard to find him." With that said, the guards yelled in the affirmative. "Yes, Your Grace." After doing so, they immediately departed from the castle and formed a search party to find Agnellus. While Berengar, Lind, and Honoria waited, Berengar began to ask a question of his own to the girl. "So tell me, Valeria, what is Antioch like?" Honoria had no response to this question. She had never been to Antioch, nor had she ever had anyone describe what the city was like to her. She could probably imagine a fake answer, but it would be easily discovered if Berengar looked into it. As such, she gave a vague answer trying to deflect the question. "Oh, it is just like any other city in the empire." To this, Berengar smiled and nodded his head politely while saying a typical response. Of course. However, her lack of knowledge of the city she claimed to be from only further convinced Berengar that the girl in front of him was, in fact, Princess Honoria. Only a girl locked up her entire life would use a major city of the empire as her backstory and not know the first thing about it. Lind was also cautiously watching the scene, and though Honoria did not realize her lies had been seen through, Heraclius sure noticed it. However, despite being on alert, he did not sense any hostility from Berengar and Lind, only pity. Heraclius had an excellent judge of human character. Something told him that Berengar was not the kind of man that would cause unnecessary harm to Honoria, even if deep down the eagle could tell that Berengar was by no means a kind-hearted man. As such, the trio began to make pleasant conversation over the meal, waiting for Agnellus to arrive so they could continue this grand charade that everyone in the room was aware was an enormous lie. It would be some time until Agnellus was found, and by the time he arrived, all of the food would have been consumed by the people sitting at the table. Chapter 245, Getting Down to Business. By the time Agnellus arrived at the castle, Berengar and the others were long since finished with the meal and had been making small talk. At the moment, Berengar was sipping tea out of a porcelain teacup that his ceramics industry had created. It was painted with the depiction of the battle at Oberstdorf. Berengar commonly sold porcelain tea sets that depicted his various deeds, inspired by the old Greek vases that showed the legends and myths of their mythology. They were pretty popular among the nobility of Austria due to their high quality and visually appealing aesthetics. Agnellus was out of breath when he walked in and saw Honoria with a broad smile on her face carelessly chatting away with the Duke of Austria. He had spent the last hour or so searching all over the place for her, only for the town guards to grab him and escort him to the castle without explanation. As such, he quickly called out to her, "Lady Valeria, you had me worried sick." The man had become accustomed to calling the princess by her alter ego for some time now and had no trouble doing so. Berengar was not surprised by this in the slightest and merely had his servants open up a place at the table for Agnellus. "Agnellus, I presume? You must be starving. Sit, and I will have some food brought to you as we dine on dessert." Seeing that the princess was safe and sound while appearing to get along quite well with the target of her affections, the worry that had built up in Agnellus's heart began to subside. As such, he did as he was instructed and sat down at the table, where a chalice of wine was quickly poured for him. Only after the man had taken a sip from the chalice did Berengar begin to address business concerns. "I have heard from Lady Valeria that you are the one in charge of business matters. I am quite curious, what is your relationship with the young lady?" Agnellus looked over at Honoria and slowly examined her for a moment. He was unaware of what she had said about him towards Berengar, so he decided to play it safe and answer vaguely. "Your Grace, I am just a humble servant who has a mind for business. The lady wanted to visit you personally as a show of good faith, and thus I brought her here." Berengar nodded his head at the man, though behind his warm facade, he was slowly examining Honoria's reaction to his statement. As such, he decided to continue the conversation. "So tell me, what exactly is your proposal to get involved with my jewelry business?" Hearing that Berniger had shifted onto the topic of he had been waiting or, a broad smile appeared across Agnellus's face as he made his proposal. "I can ferry your fine jewelry to a new market throughout the empire. For this, I would like to split the profits gained from the trade 50-50. Hearing this, a sly smile formed across Berengar's lips as he began to make a counteroffer. "If it is merely ferrying my goods to the east and selling them, I believe a 50-50 split is a bit unfair for me. After all, I have to incur the costs of acquiring the materials and paying for the labor of the jewelry's construction. Before long, I will have a trade fleet of my own that is capable of sailing across the Mediterranean. Tell me, why would I need you?" To this, Agnellus was not discouraged. Instead, he presented his reasoning. "If you wish to trade in the empire as a foreigner, you will have to pay tariffs. You will also have to go through weaving a trade network in the east from scratch. With me, you can bypass the tariffs and make use of my extensive trade routes that cover the entirety of the empire." After hearing this, Berengar thought about it for a few moments. Tariffs would be a minor problem, but trying to access the empire's trade networks as a foreigner, especially as a German, was not the simplest of tasks. After all, there was still some prejudice in the empire towards his kind for destroying the Western Empire centuries ago and claiming to be the legitimate successors of Rome in the form of the Holy Roman Empire. After careful consideration, Berengar decided to negotiate further. "I will agree that you make a persuasive argument, but 50-50 is out of the question. As the producer of the supplies, I will take a 75% cut, and you will take 25%. Despite the massive profit this could yield for both parties, Agnellus was not content with such terms, and thus he counteroffered with a more balanced offer. 60-40, that is as low as I can go. I still have to grease the palms of imperial officials to avoid the importation tariff." Berengar found this acceptable and nodded his head with a smile on his face before reaching out his hands to accept the terms. "Very well, 60-40 it is. I will have a contract drafted where we will both sign. Seeing as we both have a witness, you do not have a problem with such a thing, do you?" Agnellus smiled amicably at the terms Berengar presented and responded to his question. "Not at all. It sounds fair to me." At this moment, another thought appeared in his mind, and it pertained to the girl sitting next to him. Thus he quickly hatched another scheme as he made one more request of Berengar. "By the way, could you help me out with a situation I am in?" Hearing this, Berengar frowned. He could tell exactly where this was heading, and as such, carefully eyed Honoria with his peripheral vision before responding to Agnellus. "It would entirely depend on what is requested of me." Seeing Berengar's expression and tone shift, Agnellus knew to pawn the girl off onto him would be an uphill battle, but he had to do so for Honoria's sake. Thus he mustered the courage to make his demands to the mighty duke sitting in front of him. The Lady Valeria's home life is somewhat volatile at the moment, and for her safety, I would like her to stay here in Kufstein under your protection far from the troubles in the east. Do you think you can keep her here for the time being as a representative of my interests? Hearing this, Lind began to scowl, which did not go unnoticed by Honoria. Since her arrival, Lind had been feuding with the runaway princess over her attempts to get close to Berengar, and Berengar had maintained his distance because of this. Thus Honoria was worried Berengar would send her away. If he did so, she did not have a backup plan. Berengar was a wise man and immediately pointed out the flaw in Agnelis's request with a snide remark. But Agnelis, you stated earlier that you were a mere servant of the Lady Valeria. What gives you the right to appoint a noblewoman such as herself as your representative? Hearing Berengar's response, Agnelis knew he had overplayed his hand and had to think of an excuse quickly. As such, he made up a lie on the spot hoping Berengar would buy it. The truth is that I hold a fairly prestigious position within the Zonera household, and I do have the authority to negotiate such a thing. What do you say? You would be doing me a solid, and in return, I can go 65-35. Agnelis lamented the loss he would be taking in profits, but at this point, he had grown too attached to Honoria to allow her to roam the streets of the world like a wayward vagabond. Thus he was willing to take a loss to ensure her safety. After all, Berengar seemed like he was fully capable of protecting the princess. Agnelis could see he was interested in Honoria despite the duke's hesitation, which was a good sign. Thus he felt like she would be safe in Kufstein and was willing to take a minor cut to ensure the girl's security. Melissa would never forgive him if he put profits over the princess's safety. Berengar sighed heavily as he took a sip from his tea. After a long period of silence, he made his decision known. Fine, if it is just keeping her safe for a while, I don't see why not. Especially since you were kind enough to increase my share in return. The moment Berengar said this, Honoria was delighted and filled with excitement, while Lind stared at Berengar with a scornful expression. There were two reasons for this. One, she did not yet approve of Honoria as a candidate for one of Berengar's wives. After all, there was a high possibility the girl was lying about her identity and thus could not be trusted. Secondly, if she was really who Lind and Berengar suspected her to be, Berengar was bringing trouble upon their doorstep if he accepted this girl into his care. This was what worried Lind the most. Berengar may be powerful, but to contend with the Byzantine Empire was not something he was fully capable of at this moment. Could he defend their borders from a possible Byzantine incursion? Quite likely, but the Byzantine navy could make trade exceptionally difficult with Austria and in doing so, stagnate their economy. Such an outcome would be disastrous for Berengar's restoration efforts. Berengar could not deploy his troops to the Mediterranean, and thus what was most likely to occur was a complete blockade on Austrian ports in Istria. Of course, this was the worst-case scenario and entirely depended on if the Byzantines found out about Honoria's location and decided to blame Berengar for her disappearance. To Berengar, on the other hand, he was much more worried about sending the girl away without protection. If she was truly Princess Honoria and he dismissed her from his care, and some harm came to her. When the Byzantines found out about such an event, they could blame him for the incident. Thus he decided to keep her under his protection until he could verify her identity. If she turned out to be the princess of the Byzantine Empire, he would contact Arethes, informing him of the princess's location, and tell him to bring a caravan to escort the princess back home. Thus, while Honoria was happy she found a place to stay, Berengar was already scheming to find out her real identity and how to defuse the time bomb that her arrival had potentially become. After agreeing to Agnelis's terms, the man smiled and thanked Berengar from the bottom of his heart. You have my eternal gratitude, Your Grace. Berengar put on a friendly smile and nodded. With this, business was concluded, and for the time being, Honoria was allowed to stay within the castle of Kufstein. Chapter 246 Glory to the Empire. Over a month had passed since Honoria's disappearance, and despite the Byzantine imperial family's best efforts, they had completely and utterly failed to locate the girl. They were beginning to fear for the worst. While the emperor was struggling to deal with the fallout of his daughter's reckless behavior, Arethes was marching an army into Egypt. They had set sail from Ionia not long ago, and they arrived in Egypt not far from what remained of the territory of the Byzantines' decades-long conflict of invading the region. Despite the Byzantines' best efforts, the Mamluk Sultanate still held control of Egypt, Cyrene, and most of North Africa, thus leaving the Byzantine Empire in a never-ending war for reclaiming lost territory. If not for the vast wealth gained from the Levant and the trade routes connected to the Mediterranean, the Byzantines would have had to give up this conflict long ago. However, today was different. Today, Arethusa marched with an army of 15,000 men. These men were equipped with matchlock arquebus firearms and pikes. Through Berengar's intervention in the timeline, the arquebus, or arquebus, had become a reality far earlier than in his past life, and he had sold them in great numbers to the Byzantines while aiding them in the development of pike and shot formations. The reason for this was simple. Berengar intended for the Byzantines to be a great power in the East and act not only as a bulwark in defense of the Muslim world but as an ally he could rely upon to aid him against his enemies. Berengar had thoroughly outraged the Catholic world with his Reformation, and in doing so, created many hostile states surrounding his borders. If he did not foster a powerful alliance with the East, he would undoubtedly be fighting a coalition of the European powers by himself. After spending a lifetime at war, he would surely end up like Napoleon. Thus, in order to ensure that he would have a powerful ally, Berengar intended to restore the lost glory of Rome to fight alongside him against his enemies. Today was the first day that the Byzantine Empire showed off its newfound military might against the Saracens who sought to destroy her. Arethusa sat on horseback at the rear of his formation, protected by his guards. In the field, the Byzantine army equipped with their mirror-pattern armor held their arquebuses and pikes in their hands as the Mamluk forces gathered on the other side of the sands. Arethusa had spent a significant degree of time, effort, and expense arming and training his army in the new weapons and tactics. Initially, he had desired to spend more time getting acquainted with their use, but unfortunately, Alexandria had fallen, and he was forced to move his forces to retake what was lost before their training was complete. Unlike the Hussites, Berengar had not provided the Byzantines with any primitive form of field artillery. Thus at the moment, they were merely organized into arquebus, pike, and cavalry units. The Mamluk army was a traditional medieval formation and was quite confused when they saw the formations and weapons wielded by the Byzantines. Nevertheless, the battle had begun as the Mamluks began to march into battle. Seeing this, Arethusa ordered his armies to meet the enemy in battle. Soon, the troops would clash in the center of the field, where they would fight to the death to determine a winner. Eventually, the armies began to close the gap where Arethusa shouted his commands, which the officers and NCOs relayed among the rank and file of the soldiers. Hold your ground until you see the whites in their eyes. This was a phrase Berengar had given Arethusa as the basis of when his troops should fire their weapons. Berengar had long since surpassed the need for such tactics with his rifled muskets. Still, for a smoothbore arquebus, the effective range was limited, and to gain the most effective use of their weapons, they would have to fire upon their enemies when they were at extremely close range. The Byzantines held their ground for some time. However, many of the men in their army did not have the discipline and strength of will to hold on until their enemy was mere feet away. Thus, when the enemy drew near one by one, they would fire their shots, often missing their targets in the initial charge. Though Arethusa tried to control this, it created a ripple effect. Pretty soon, the entire line had fired, and though many of their shots had hit their mark, cutting down the enemy infantry, the impact they had was not as destructive as it could have been. After the rounds were fired, Arethusa was forced to deploy the pikemen to protect his infantry as they reloaded. Thus, the Mamluk soldiers quickly found themselves skewered at the end of the 20-foot-long weapons. By the time the Mamluks had gotten past the pike wall, the Byzantine arquebusiers had fully reloaded and fired a second volley. This time the effect was far more devastating to the enemy line. Seeing his forces being rapidly cut down by the Byzantine firearms, the Mamluk general instantly ordered his cavalry to charge. Thus the heavily armored Mamluk cavalry rushed towards the Byzantine lines, and yet as they drew near, the pikes were lowered in their direction, causing the horses to buck wild in fright and flee in the other direction. Many of their riders had been cast from their horses onto the sand below as a result. Others found themselves incapable of controlling their mighty steeds until they had reached a point where they were safe from the enemy pike wall. Seeing this, Arethusa merely smirked. The battle was beginning to head in his favor. Though the Mamluk forces outnumbered them, the combined force of pike and shot was well beyond this medieval era's capabilities. Though it was not as effective as Berengar's tactics, it was more than enough to crush the armies of the Mamluk Sultanate. Arethas watched the sight of the battlefield with glee as the Mamluk forces began to rout. Quickly saying a prayer to God, he rallied his cavalry forces and began to charge the frightened Saracens. The Byzantine cataphracts rushed down the hillside and into the fray, where they collided with the routing enemy while wielding their lances, skewering them upon impact and sending their souls to the afterlife. The result of this battle was an overwhelming victory in favor of the Byzantine Empire. After cleaning up the battlefield, Arethas stood along with his ranks of men, where he began to chastise them for firing their first volley early. All of you are soldiers of the Empire, and yet you have failed in your duty. If not for the overwhelming advantage of our weapons and tactics, we could have lost this battle today. Why? Because many of you were frightened by the enemy charge and fired your first shot out of fear, missing your targets entirely as you did so. I expect more of the men beneath my command, and thus during the rest of this campaign, I want you all to perform much better than you did today. If every one of you can get to the point where you follow my commands to the letter, then this campaign will be an overwhelming victory for our armies. Glory to the Empire. After hearing Arethas' speech, the men of his army all began to salute him and yell their battle cry. Glory to the Empire. In doing so, Arethas looked fondly upon his men. They had suffered very few casualties this day, and though the Mamluk army had routed in large numbers, likely to return in the future for further conflict. This battle was an overwhelming success, one that inspired Arethas. While armed with these weapons and tactics, maybe, just maybe, the Empire could reclaim its former glory. Arethas had one man to thank for this victory, his trading partner and friend to the west. He did not know what Berengar had planned for the future, but he was certain that one day the man would surely be a mighty king, and after this battle, he felt great regret for not trying to convince the emperor to marry his only daughter off to such an outstanding young man. Then again, Berengar was already happily engaged, and Arethas doubted he could convince him to accept Honoria as his lawful wife and instead turn his fiancée into another concubine. As for the emperor, Arethas knew the man was too stubborn to make his only daughter the concubine of some king from the west. Thus it was simply not meant to be. As he thought about this, Arethas began to wonder about what had happened to the princess. Had she been found during the time he was away? Was she even alive? He would never guess that the girl had run off to Kufstein because of a few good comments he had made about Berengar. These were the thoughts that plagued Arethas' mind as he campaigned to restore the empire's borders in North Africa. This was just one battle of many to occur with the Mamluk Sultanate. Only time could tell if the empire was to restore its former glory. Chapter 247 Saying Goodbye. Days had passed since Honoria had arrived in Kufstein, and it was now time to say farewell to her friend Agnelis. Unlike Honoria, the man could not stay in Kufstein for long. He had a business that he had to conduct, and after settling the deal with Berengar, he had to be on his way. At the moment, Honoria was at the docks of Kufstein, surrounded by a few of Berengar's guards. She was sending Agnelis off as the man returned to the borders of the Byzantine Empire. In Honoria's hands was the jewelry she had snatched from her room before running away from home. It was the payment she had promised Agnelis for taking her to Kufstein. She quietly handed the jewelry over to Agnelis with a bitter smile on her face. During their journey together, she had grown quite fond of the older merchant, not to the point of romance but strictly as friends. As such, she was sad to see him go. Here you go, Agnelis. As promised, this is payment for taking me to Kufstein. You and your sister have my eternal gratitude. I pray that I have not caused you too much trouble in assisting me. Though Honoria was naive due to being locked away her entire life, she had seen some of the evil of the world and knew if Melissa or Agnelis were caught for their crimes of assisting Honoria in her escape, they would likely be executed, and as such she greatly dreaded this possibility. However, Agnelis's actions shocked Honoria as he pushed the small box filled with jewelry back into Honoria's hands and returned her bitter smile with a friendly one. Keep it, truly the honor of assisting you in your journey was payment enough. Besides, I was going to go to Kufstein anyway, and thanks to you, I was able to establish a rather favorable trade deal with the Duke. Hearing this, a small tear began to form in one of Honoria's mint-green eyes. Agnelis and Melissa had taken such a huge risk for her, and in the end, they wanted nothing in return. They were truly good people. As such, she ran up and hugged the man and thanked him for his assistance. Thank you so much. Agnellus blushed in response to this as he eventually broke free from the girl's grasp. After doing so, he gave her some solid advice. This content is taken from lightnovelpub.com. Be careful around Berengar. He is a very sly and cunning man. His lover also appears to have a sharp wit. They may not be as good as people as you think they are. I am sure they already have begun to suspect that you are lying to them about your identity. If you genuinely want to make the Duke yours, you will have to settle for being another one of his women. I could tell at first glance that he was not the kind of man to give up his treasures in return for another prize of equal or slightly greater value. Whatever you do, please do not reveal your identity before you are confident he has fallen for you. If you do, he is liable to inform your family. After all, the moment he finds out who you are, he will be knowingly harboring a runaway princess, which is a severe crime in the eyes of your family. Hearing this, Honoria began to wipe the tears from her eyes, and a determined expression took over her flawless face as she nodded at Agnellus's advice before responding to it. I will take what you have said to heart. Honoria was impressed with Berengar, but she, too, sensed some form of danger from the man. Thus she was not yet sure if she was the man she wanted to give herself to. Nevertheless, she would use this time to learn more about the man and herself. It would be quite some time before Berengar found out her true identity. If Berengar disappointed her in any way, she would move along in her life. After all, she did not plan to be a bird in yet another cage. Hearing Honoria takes his advice to heart, Agnellus pet her glossy white hair before saying his goodbyes. Well, I trust you to take care of yourself. I must be going now. Not only do I have to unload these jewels, but I also have to search for my sister, who should surely be in hiding right now. I pray that we may meet again, Your Highness. With that, Agnellus bowed before stepping onto his galley. The ship quickly set sail, leaving Honoria in the harbor, watching her friend depart. Heraclius was flying in the sky following the vessel to make sure it had reached the river well enough. He would return in a few hours after he was satisfied with the results. For more, visit lightnovelpub.com. Honoria was not like Conrad. Berengar had no intentions of leaving her confined in the castle. She was free to roam the city so long as she had a proper escort. The escort's job was simply there to protect Honoria. As for collecting information on her, there were plenty of spies in Kufstein under Berengar's command who could silently track her movements. After Honoria's arrival, Lind had quickly set her spies to task with infiltrating the Byzantine Empire and collecting information on two people, Princess Honoria, and the identity she was using while in Kufstein, Valeria Zonera. However, it would be some time before her spies even arrived in Constantinople and Antioch, let alone began to gather intelligence. Thus, for now, all Berengar and Lind could do was watch the girls' interactions in Kufstein. With Agnellus's departure, Honoria had some free time on her hands, so she decided to spend it walking around Kufstein and getting acquainted with the locals. The fact that Berengar's guard protected her meant she was essential to the Duke, and as such, nobody threatened to make a move on her as she walked through the city. The city of Kufstein was beginning to look like an early modern city. It had small and large shops located in the trade district. Some of these shops were owned by the nobility, others by Berniger's dynasty, and the growing middle class owned a few. As such, she visited a clothing shop to witness the beautiful Austrian fashion she had seen Lind wearing. Despite her luxurious silk clothes, she was fascinated with the designs that had appeared in Kufstein and began trying on dresses in the shop. These dresses were made for the common folk, and yet they still had some degree of embroidery on their bodices. The noblewomen typically had their dresses hand-tailored by unique shops dedicated solely to upper-class fashion. Thus, after getting acquainted with the common folk's fashion, she entered one of the largest noble fashion stores, where she saw exquisite and detailed dresses that were like works of art. While Berengar had implemented modern women's underwear, he was also a big fan of the corset. They were now commonly worn by women of all statuses with their dresses. When Honoria saw that several of the women in the shop looked abnormally busty, she was surprised. She had no idea what a corset was or how it helped with a woman's figure. Seeing the beautiful young woman dressed in foreign attire enter the store, the shop clerk quickly came over to Honoria and began to inquire what kind of fashion she was interested in. I apologize if this comes off strange, but you are as beautiful as a princess. I think you would look wondrous in some of the dresses our shop has to offer. I suggest this lovely mint green and gold dress that is exclusive to our shops. It will go perfect with your eyes. For more, visit lightnovelpub.com. Honoria was immediately overwhelmed by the shop clerk. Still, before she could respond, she was thrust into the changing room and quickly measured all over her body by the tailor, which she felt significantly violated her privacy. As such, she immediately began to blush. After doing so, the tailor, who was a woman, formed a smile on her face as she proclaimed Honoria's measurements aloud. 30c20 to 30, not bad. Do not worry, I will have a dress fit for you in no time. The shop's clerks and tailors did not bother to see if the woman could pay the ridiculous price for the high-end fashion. After all, she was protected by Berengar's guards, and if that were the case, even if she couldn't pay, they could always build a castle for the expense. Berengar was known to pay a fair price for his fiancées' and lovers' dresses, and because of this, nearly every tailor in the city had desired to make a dress for one of his women. After some time, Honoria walked out of the stall in a mint green dress with gold embroidery in the Elizabethan fashion style from Berengar's previous life. Due to the corset she was wearing, she felt incredibly uncomfortable at first, and yet it highlighted her already perfect figure, making her look far more desirable. As she approached the counter with an awkward smile, she informed the clerk that all she could pay with was jewelry. I don't have any of the local currency on me. I can only pay with jewelry, is that all right? Though Honoria was uncomfortable with being forced into this situation, she loved how the dress looked on her and did not want to leave it behind. However, the clerk merely smiled at her and informed her it was hers to take. Do not worry about that. If you are close to Berengar, he will properly compensate us. Just make sure to tell everyone where you got the lovely dress. With this, Honoria nodded and departed with her bodyguards. After doing so, she headed back towards the castle. She did not know why, but she wanted to get Berengar's approval of her new dress as quickly as possible. Visit Light Novel Pub. See Ohm for the best novel reading experience. Chapter 248 Dreams of the Future. Honoria quickly returned to the castle with a desire to show off her new dress to Berengar. However, she was not familiar with the layout and promptly got lost. By sheer chance, she ended up at Berengar's study, where he was currently working on approving naval expenses and drafting new ship designs. A powerful navy was a versatile navy, and while Berengar's shipyards were being constructed, he would draw many different blueprints for future vessels. Berengar was drafting a 20-gun sloop of war based upon the USS Boston, which was commissioned in 1825 during his previous life. It was a fast and agile single-deck ship armed with 24-pound cannons. While drafting the blueprints, Berengar heard a knock on the door and assumed it was Lind, as she was usually the one who visited him during the day. As such, he said with a smile on his face, "Babe, you know it's open. Do you need to knock?" Upon hearing this, Honoria began to flush as she slowly opened the door and revealed her gorgeous figure in her new dazzling dress. Berengar was quite shocked when he saw this and scratched his head with an awkward expression when he saw it was not Lind in his doorway. "Lady Valeria, I am sorry I mistook you for someone else. Is there something I can help you with?" Honoria meekly entered the room as she responded to Berengar's comment. "Not really, I was just curious, is all. I haven't seen your face in a few days and wanted to know what you were up to." After doing so, the princess twirled around in her new dress, giving Berengar the hint to comment on it. Berengar had to admit she did look perfect in the dress, but he had a nagging suspicion that he would be the one ending up paying for it. So instead of complimenting her as she wanted, he merely asked the question on his mind. "How much did that dress cost me?" Hearing this, Honoria began to pout. She had not gotten the response that she desired and quietly muttered under her breath, "I don't know." Berengar found this to be adorable, and as such, he smiled before giving the girl what she wanted. "Well, whatever it cost, it was worth it. It looks perfect on you." After hearing this, Honoria blushed and smiled before she began to sit down in the chair in front of Berengar's desk. As she did so, Berengar placed his quill down before covering the ship blueprints with his naval expense reports. He did not want such sensitive information being leaked, and as such, he began informing the girl of his more boring actions these past few days so that she would lose interest. "As for what I am up to, I am merely attending to matters of the state. As a duke, I have a lot of work cut out for me. For the most part, it is rather boring." Honoria merely nodded her head, disinterested as she heard this. However, she read the bold words at the top of Berengar's paper. Her understanding of the German language was rudimentary, but she could still read the word, naval. As someone deeply fascinated with sailing, she was curious about this and thus asked. Naval expenses? Am I reading that right? I didn't know that Austria had a navy. Hearing this, Berengar's pleasant smile turned sour as he tried to conceal what he was up to. The building of a grand Austrian navy was crucial to his plans, and at the moment, he was trying to hide his dreams for as long as possible. As such, he tried to dissuade the girl in front of him from prying into his business. Lady Valeria, I know you are naturally curious, but it is not polite to pry into the business of someone else's territory. I will forgive you for the moment, but I hope you do not try to entangle yourself with my affairs any further. Hearing this, Honoria began to pout as she responded to Berengar's words. I am sorry, I am just interested in sailing, is all. I got excited when I saw the word naval. I promise I won't look at your documents in the future. Hearing this, Berengar was curious and thus asked Honoria the question on his mind. You are interested in sailing, huh? Is that your dream? To sail across the Mediterranean as free as an eagle with nothing but the salty wind of the sea to keep you company? Honoria began to contemplate Berengar's words for a few moments before responding honestly. Truthfully, I do not know. I have never had the luxury to think about what my dreams for the future are. I suppose you could say I am still finding that out. Hearing this, Berengar began to feel pity for the girl. However, the next question she asked him shocked him. What about you? What are your dreams? This was a question Berengar commonly thought about, and as such, he put on a pleasant smile as he informed Honoria about his ambitions for life. At first, I wanted nothing more than to inherit my family's lands and spend a good 30 years or so bettering the lives of my people, and by extension my family and myself, before retiring to some villa near a lake to live the rest of my days in peace. Hearing this, Honoria was curious. It seemed like a noble goal. However, she noticed he prefaced the statement with the term at first, and as such, she was curious about what he thought. As such, she inquired further about it. And now? Berengar sighed before his expression turned solemn. As it did so, he revealed the heights of his ambitions. The world is a cruel and unforgiving place. I learned that pretty early on in life. If I can do a little evil to achieve great things, then I will do so. I yearn for the unification of my people, and I don't simply mean the Austrians, but all Germans. Those who speak the German language and have some form of German culture should be united in a single empire to thrive and determine their destiny free of foreign interference. Everybody else contending for the title of King of Germany is doing so in pursuit of their vain glory. I know I can do better, and in doing so, I can better the lives of all German people, even if it comes at the expense of other cultures and ethnic groups. Thus I will fight trying to achieve this and even die in pursuit of my dream if necessary. A dream is something you should pursue even if everyone else says it is impossible, something you are willing to kill and die to achieve. When you finally feel such overwhelming passion for something, you know that you have found your purpose in life, or so it is my belief. History will either remember me as the world's greatest villain or Germany's greatest hero. Either way, I do not care, so long as I can accomplish my dream. Hearing Berengar speak so passionately about his dreams inspired Honoria to find what she cared about so deeply. As such, she asked Berengar for guidance on the issue. What do you think my purpose is? Berengar sighed heavily and shook his head before responding. That is for you to find out, but if you are fascinated by sailing, it might be a good place to start. For now, I can hire a few sailors to teach you how to sail a riverboat. If you end up falling in love with it, I can always send you to Istria in the future, where I am establishing a naval academy. Honoria was touched when she heard this and instantly placed her hands on her heart as she listened to Berengar's kind words. She quickly followed up by asking Berengar the thoughts on her mind. You would do this for me? Berengar smiled and nodded as he said so. Sure, why not? You are here under my protection for the time being. You might as well learn a thing or two while you can. Tears began to form in Honoria's mint eyes, and she could no longer control her overwhelming emotions. She knew it would be no small cost for Berengar to hire sailors to teach her how to sail, and yet despite barely knowing her, he was willing to go so far to help her find out her dreams in life. She could barely contain her happiness, and as such, she quickly latched onto Berengar and hugged him tightly while whimpering in his chest. Thank you. Berengar did not know what exactly this girl had been through to be so happy over what to him was such a little favor. However, he decided to let the girl cry herself out into his doublet and merely patted her head as she did so. Of course, the moment Honoria latched onto him, Berengar could see the sky-blue eyes of Lind staring at him with a murderous glare in the doorway. This sight immediately sent shivers down Berengar's spine, and though he tried to jump up from his seat, he was held down by the whimpering princess. Lind did not bother entering the room. Berengar had already seen her displeased appearance in the doorway, and that alone was enough to send a message to him. When she finally left, Berengar sighed deeply before thinking in his mind. I am going to pay for this later.